Hello, everyone. I should give you a good welcome, even it's virtually. We would love to personally meet you, everyone, in a good conference that we can meet and chat and exchange ideas. But thanks for the modern technology, we can actually reach farther than we usually do. So now we have more than 15 countries, scholars, speakers from more than 15 countries participating with us. So this is actually a good achievement using modern technology. First, I have to thank you in the name of my colleagues Rita Lucarelli and Stephen Quirke, and welcoming you for a conference that we promised to be a good experience. And we hope that you enjoy the conference and the papers that have been selected very carefully. We have received more than 75 papers, and for technical reasons related to the program itself, on 3 days, divided on 3 days, and the volume as the proceeding of the conference, we couldn't accommodate more than what we have now. But we received many excellent papers that we couldn't accommodate for technical reasons. So this is also a good sign about how important visual aspects of the ancient Egyptian writings. I have also to thank our special team that they work behind the scene. So let me read their names. I think, yeah, I will just read their names in order to thank their efforts and their yeah. So just bear with me. So yeah, so we are really grateful for them because without them, this conference would never be done in this way. So we speak about, we thank Rachel Barnas and Beatrice de Faveri and Walid Elsayed and Maysa Kassem and Jason Silvestri. A very good thanks for them, and we hope for you to enjoy all the papers. And I think I hand the microphone to Rita, my dear colleague, to start another welcome for you.
Thank you, Hany.
Rita.
Yes, and I will follow up saying that, of course, I'm glad to be here as well today in the next 2 days. It's very early here in California, 7 a.m., but it's worth to get up so early in order to explore with you the visual complexity and creativity of the ancient Egyptian writing. As a matter of fact, the visual qualities of the ancient Egyptian scripts are still understudied in literary compositions, from hymns and liturgies to narrative tales, leaving an urgent need for more detailed analytical research which this conference aims to stimulate. And in 1927, Gardiner, in his Egyptian grammar, already wrote that the decorative character of the hieroglyphic script and its close connection with pictorial art made it a natural and handy medium of ornamentation. Now, transliterations and translations cannot, of course, render such a decorative character of the hieroglyphic script. Either can open up perspectives on the potential semantic connotations or of soundless signs, such as the so-called determinatives. And so we hope today to discuss these complex and fascinating issues on visual variety of words written in hieroglyphs. And I pass the word to Stefan.
Thank you very much, Rita, and thank you, Hany. To both of you also for conceiving the idea and developing it. It's been really wonderful to join you on this adventure. And everyone has seen, and Jason Silvestri has just put into the chat the program if you haven't got it already, but I think you all have an idea of what we're trying to cover. So with the session headings, we tried to give a sense of the focus. So today, moving from the pictorial realism and the writing strategies, keyword strategies, and then turning our focus to perception and representation. And tomorrow, we'll be moving on to consider creative development of glyphs. That's continuing that exploration of the signs and words, signs for words, seeing names, seeing power. And the second session tomorrow, in written content and spatial context, all those questions around script, form, graphic, syntax, we'll find them opening up in different directions. For me, that's very exciting to see. It can both move towards the widest visions, the vision of Akhenaten, or the one formed for him, and towards specific technologies that are being practiced in life alongside the technologies of communication. And then we'll end tomorrow with the verbal pictorial metaphors that place us firmly in the heart of the questions of visual poetics that Hany himself brings to the fore in his own remarkable works. So tomorrow we'll be ending with a second keynote lecture, which is generously offered by Champollion, which will give us a foretaste of all those 2022 events around the decipherment of hieroglyphs, which his ancestor is justly celebrated. And our third day, with innovation and writing practice, we want to have an opportunity to focus on lexemes and glyphs at that level of practice. That includes thought practice, with the final conference session on visual creativity, allowing us to think further around that perhaps most lively current debate around determinatives or classifiers, one to which papers and other sessions will be contributing. Now, of course, all of these papers, they will merge in together. And as we'll see today, that in a way echoes the way perhaps the hieroglyphic script and its cursive variants operate as well. So I like to think of ourselves through the structure of this conference as working out in some way the same creative processes of the word in a different forum. For the final keynote lecture, Ludwig Moritz will be taking us out to a West Asian parallel life of scripts that we consider based on signs for single phonemes. So we're really looking forward to this as a kind of a carnival of thought with constructive comments and questions as we explore these areas, and people like myself who are chairing sessions, keeping an eye on the time, which I am doing as I speak. So I would also like to thank that outstanding research support team, because all of you have helped in making this conference a reality. Maysa, Rachel, Beatrice, Walid, Jason, my dad also, Ahmed Osman. I mean, you really made this possible. So for all of us, we're very grateful to you. The five of you on that core team, there is that ancient Egyptian title, the great of the five, the greatest of the five, what do you? I think each of you hold that. It's really been great to work with you. Thank you. So on that note, I think it's time for me, a couple of minutes early, but I think I want to give our first keynote speaker all of the time possible. I would like to move now to introduce Professor Verhoeven. I first met Ursula Verhoeven when she was researching the 26th dynasty Heretian Papyri as the Professor of Egyptology in Mainz now. She has been, of course, co-director with Jochen Karl at the Free University of Berlin and with Professor Mahmoud Redraghi in Sohag University on the Elsayed project that really revolutionized our understanding, not only of the necropolis at Elsayed, not only of the life of that region of Upper Egypt, but also through that extraordinary tomb chapel as a library of literature, the Chapel for Governor Itib Iqra, which is filled with those New Kingdom hieratic excerpts from works of ancient Egyptian literature. You know, as always in Egypt, you learn to expect news every week, every day that changes how we think. And that's also why it's great to bring everyone together in this conference. So we're really especially delighted to welcome Professor Verhoeven today as our first keynote speaker, and it is for me a particular personal pleasure as I've been following the work, although we haven't in fact worked together on a project, but her work has been extraordinarily influential for all of us, and for myself particularly, moving both with the papyri and with the hieratic. Of course, as a hieraticist, I have special interests here, but I think for all of us, there's something special to learn. So I think as we're coming up to 1:15, if we can allow myself to go mute and to hand over to Professor Verhoeven for the first keynote lecture, I invite you, Ursula, to open our conference.
Yes, thanks a lot, Stephen, and of course, Rita and Hany for inviting me for this keynote lecture. And I would like to meet you all with a glass of wine or coffee or something else, but I think we have to wait some more months, maybe, to do it in any place where it will be possible. Yeah, wonderful science. I have chosen this title for my keynote lecture, not only because of the nearly jubilee of Carter's famous answer, yes, wonderful things, which is nearly 99 years ago, but it was because of the value of the science for writing in ancient Egypt. The hieroglyphs were never only abstract lines for noting the sounds or phonemes of a language or the spelling of words, but were believed to be wonderful and powerful, and they are still today aesthetically mostly beautiful in the eyes of any kind of beholders. The hieroglyphs give us insights into thought patterns about the animate and the inanimate environment, and inscriptions often convey in the view of the ancient Egyptians magic and power, whether it be for never-ending existence and regeneration or for total destruction. The hieroglyphic system was not without reason constantly used as the writing system for more than 3,000 years, and it was still of interest for many people in several countries over the world within a couple of centuries of the last 2,000 years, for us, for example. The focus of the current conference lies on rethinking visual aesthetics. That means to me the search for a new approach to detect and to understand visual aspects and the perception of the ancient Egyptian writing systems, their artistic design and their different applications. Thanks to the organizers who developed this interesting topic, a selection of international specialists will present truly exciting lectures about very different sources, theories, and ideas. During my keynote lecture, I can only mention some personal ideas with spotlights on the material, hoping to guide you into a few aspects of the broad and complex theme. Before starting with an explanation of the structure of my lecture, I would like to stress the current trend of Egyptological research, focusing on material and structural aspects of writing, and partly, of course, also on visual aesthetics. This trend has been in the air since about 10 or 20 years. One can observe and name a graphic turn within cultural studies after or beside the spatial, the iconic or visual, and the material turn. Writing studies, in German called Schreibwissenschaft and Schriftlinguistik, seem to be up to date, and the next 3 days will show us that there is still a lot to do, or in some cases, most cases, maybe just already done. Several larger relevant projects started very recently. I will only mention some which take place within the German-speaking community, of course, with international contacts. In alphabetic order, I have to start with my own project in Mainz, AKU, Altägyptische Kursivschriften, preparing a digital paleography focusing on hieratic and cursive hieroglyphs, their development, structure, and also the visual content. The group around Rebecca Döhl, Corpus Altägyptischer Multimodaler Kommunikation, describes their aim as follows. The focus is on the construction of a digital corpus which collects data for graphic communication Could you please switch on your microphone all? Yeah. And develops methods to systematically describe, annotate, and visualize texts, images, and text-image compositions, as well as their spatial meaning. Crossing boundaries. This project is looking for understanding complex scribal practices in ancient Egypt, and researchers from Basel, Turin, and Lüttich cooperate. The project purposes a contextualized, interdisciplinary approach to the written material produced by the highly literate ancient Egyptian community of the Medina. The Demotic Paleographical Database Project in Heidelberg is like ACU, not only a paleography, but includes chronological, topographical, text typological, and material-specific aspects of this script. The special research group SFB Manuskriptkulturen in Hamburg was or is looking for both cultural context and the universal categories and shared characteristics of manuscript cultures. And a similar group on Materiale Textkulturen in Heidelberg focuses on the specific materiality, the evoked presence of the inscribed artifacts and the written texts themselves. Their main idea is that writing, script-bearing artifacts, and related practices are bound by an irrevocable mutual connection, which has a huge explanatory power for the understanding of the transmitted text and their cultural surroundings. As you have maybe already read in my abstract, firstly, the amic view of the literate Egyptian society on writing and its exquisite manifestations is to be sought. Secondly, a short overview will present appropriate examples for a few factors which influence visual aesthetics. And thirdly, and as a main point, the focus will lie on some interesting features of visual perception concerning handwritten signs and text and writing. So first, the search for the amic view. The Egyptian word for hieroglyphs is Medu Necha, the words of God, or Sechau and Medu Necha, the scripts of the God's words. This expression shows that people believed that the invention of writing did not go back to a particular scholar, like the famous teachings or some funerary spells. Instead, it was believed to be the work of God, respectively a goddess. I believe this Medu stave for word and speaking had maybe originally the function to stamp the ground, announcing that an important person will start to speak, by the way. The cursive script and everything connected with it are written with the scribe's instruments for writing by hand with ink on several grounds, on potsherds, wood, papyrus, leather, and so on. The script for daily purposes was later called letter script /shad. The Egyptian view that writing was an invention by gods includes that it is perfect from the outset as a system, right in its order and orthography, and aesthetic in its forms and details. Who was thought to be responsible for that? First, the goddess Seshat was connected with books when she was called principal of the house of books already in the Old Kingdom. In the New Kingdom, she received the titles Lady of the Script and Lady of the God's Verse for the first time here in the Red Chapel of Hatshepsut. Writing was called the work of Seshat, and she became Lady of the Emanations, the Bau, that means the holy writings of Re. And in Ptolemaic times, she was also said to have existed in the beginning and started with writing, respectively engravings on temple walls. Her male counterpart, the god Jehuti or Tot, here in the famous papyrus of Nesta Nebet Isheru as a secretary of the god Re, is also called Lord of the God's words since the New Kingdom, but he became principal of the House of Books only in that time and not already in the Old Kingdom. While Seshad is predominantly connected with temple building and wall decoration, Todd is mainly concerned with writing by hand on papyrus or pallet, based on the orders of Ma'at, also in the Judgment of the Dead. Apart from the divine sphere, the prince and vizier Nefer Ma'at was praised because of his skills concerning a new writing method. In his Medun Mastaba from the time of the 4th dynasty, one of his tomb inscriptions calls him the one who made his gods, so the hieroglyphs, in a script which cannot be wiped out. He invented colored inlays for the signs and for the figures of his tomb decoration. Here, with his wife Itet and 6 sons below, and the lower 4 are to be seen with their names. In this case, it is not only the attractive visual aesthetic appearance with strong and clear colors, which is something new and special, but it is a quality of impurity, which is important for the designer and the tomb owner. Skillfulness in respect to a beautiful and correct writing is a personal capacity in Egyptian Ika Jebau, which is often praised by scribes and gives them a high reputation and a successful career. Against this background, the Nomarch Kheti promises in his autobiographical inscription in Tomb 4 at Asyut from the time of Merikare, every scribe and every scholar who is skillful in his work, aptly in writing, aptly in wisdom, and so on, he should become an elder for his city, a praised one for his nome, and I will advocate for him as his support in the necropolis. It has been already often discussed whether the inscriptions and representations from the first intermediate period are of poor aesthetic quality or products of a special regional style and demand. I cannot explore this problem here in detail, but I would like to focus on a small detail. Most of the signs in this stela are not very well executed, of different size and distance to each other. But in executing the hieroglyphic sign of the head in the epithet of Anubis Tepi Juef in the upper line, the sculptor took great care to give the face the same features and colors as in the face of the figure of the tomb owner, which is just below. As a result, the whole representation achieves a very vivid impact expressed through the 3 faces, also the face of the woman, close together. And maybe a second meaning was intended, namely that the tomb owner's face is in the following of the Canid gods. Of course, in this context of skillful scribes and artists, I must not forget the famous Ichtisen, head of the artists, who wrote an extraordinary autobiographical inscription on his stela now in the Louvre. Recently, Andreas Stauder has studied the content of the stela regarding the stated knowledge about the intellectual, material, and artistic production of pictorial scenes, especially in relief. Surprisingly, the stela itself is relatively plainly decorated with 15 lines of hieroglyphics, 8 standing persons with captions, and an offering table seen below. In the captions of the persons opposite Ichtisen and his wife, even the orientation and therefore also the order of the characters is regularly reversed, possibly because the model was in hieratic and thus running from right to left. So you have to read the caption here, Saef, Semsuef, Meri F, Se en Weseret, and Saef Meri F Menshuhetep, and Saef Meri F Samontu Ma'akaru. So it's, everything is reversed. Another detail in the main inscription is interesting in respect of writing inventions. Exactly in the middle of the 6th line, we find the hieroglyph of the writing tool. Niv Allen has pointed out that the sign used here shows an interesting combination. The traditional writing tool featured a separate wash container, as you know, a leather pouch, and a small palette for the 2 colors. The newer version integrates a compartment for rush stalks into an oblong board with two wells at the top for the ink colors. The hieroglyph of Irtisen, therefore, combines the traditional character with a contemporary tool, but now the old extra container for reed pens actually became redundant. A few centuries later, in the Abydenian temple of Ramesses II, we find this relief, which again represents our scribe god Tot. He holds the contemporary narrow scribe palette as a realistic tool, but grasps also the hieroglyph for writing in his hand. While Irtisen modernized the ancient equipment itself, which corresponds to the word sign, this here, the temple artist ingeniously fused the timeless and unchanged word sign below and the modern tool in this visually aesthetic but not realistic combination. Also, our famous Senenmut, the teacher of the daughter of Hatshepsut, personally invented new signs, respectively sign combinations as cryptograms, visualizing names of his queen. And he proudly had them engraved on the shoulders of two Kuwait statues today in Cairo and Berlin. He was adding an explanation for his skillfulness. On the right side, you find the text from the Berlin statue, and here you can read in the columns images which I made as work for my heart, Tiut iri eni emkat iti, as something that was created outdoors, emiru emsechet, and was not found in the scripts of the ancestors. On the left side are the signs explained with respect to the names of Hatshepsut. My last example is borrowed from a paper of Stefan Seidelmeier. Here you can see two scribal palettes from the later 18th dynasty, which are decorated with a text full of new signs and sign combinations. And in an intentional lacuna, the wood material of the palette itself, named Mary, was used for the phonetic value of the word Mary beloved. In the sentence, he is one beloved of the ointment. So the material is something that can be seen, touched, perceived, even smelled in case of wood. And the puzzling with signs and writing ideas from the bottom of the heart, the Egyptian would say, must have repeatedly given the scribe much pleasure, playing with his palette in his hands during a break. This leads us to the second part of my lecture, the factors influencing visuality. While looking for visual aspects and talking about visual aesthetics, we should keep in mind that the visual impression in antiquity as today is influenced by a number of factors. The first condition for visual aesthetics is, of course, the light. As we just have seen, the material is very important. Secondly, the surface, smooth, rough, soft, brittle, and so on. The techniques of bringing signs on a surface by inlays, by chiseling, scratching, painting, writing with ink, etc. Of course, the colors of hieroglyphs and also of ink are important for the perception. The size allows only certain types of inscriptions. The mobility and visibility are connected with the location, whether in a landscape, like graffiti, in a temple, or as tomb decoration or equipment of any kind. And of course, also the invisibility and context and function of the factors which influence the visual aspects of writing. I can, of course, only raise a few issues with limited examples. Several times, letters by the king were copied in tombs of high officials during the Old Kingdom, as Eckhard Eichler has investigated. Rashwan copied 2 letters of the king in his tomb in Saqqara, and the one still preserved starts with these words: "My Majesty has seen this very beautiful letter, Secha Nefer Nefer, that you had brought to the palace on that beautiful day when the heart of Isesi was truly gladdened by what he truly loves." The verb is ma'a, to see the letter, not shidi, to read, or sajam, to hear, or siya, notice, like in a similar letter to Khafuf. The king looked at the letter and found it nefer nefer, beautiful or perfect. And of course, Rashwan liked the letter of the king because of this praise so much that he copied it in the court before his tomb for eternity and for people passing through. In the case of the tomb of Khafuf, we find this large and aesthetic engraving on the front of his work tomb. He wanted to demonstrate an important event in his life and did not report his 4th expedition with his own words, as he did for the first 3 journeys in other inscriptions of his tomb. No, here he copied the letter of the young King Pepi II, transcribing the original hieratic into hieroglyphs, but keeping the layout with horizontal header and vertical columns, and even the first line, which says here, Chetem Nezujes, sealed by the king himself. As you all know, the king praises and admonishes Khafuf while waiting excitedly for the return of the expedition team, bringing a dwarf from the southern lands to the residence. The everlasting, beautiful copy with only hieroglyphs endures more than 4,000 years until now, and still testifies the uniqueness of Khafuf and his king, but only to insiders being able to read the script. The visual aesthetic is underlined by first the daylight, the location facing to the Nile, which comes from the south, the stone material, the technique which gives shadow into the signs, and the function testifying the tomb owner's merits. Further prominent examples for visual aesthetics of long texts with only few or without image decoration are as well connected with special locations and functions and long-lasting and far-reaching visibility. Only a few examples: the Wadi Hammamat expedition graffiti, or those in the Aswan region, my most beautiful visitors graffito in Tomb N31 in Asyut, the Amarna boundary stela on the right side, or the pseudo-epigraphic humus note stela, famine stela in the landscape of the first cataract, just to name some examples with extremely impressive script layouts. Another factor influencing the visibility and therefore also the aesthetic quality lies in the function of signs. As you all know, we have many examples for mutilated signs, and Rune Niord will talk about this phenomenon concerning hieroglyphs of living beings on Saturday. I will show you another method for making the single signs harmless for the reader. Here, the signs are still complete, but have been made harmless through the reversal of direction. This is a long inscription of a harper's song in the tomb of Onuris Kha in Medina, and several bad sparrow birds occur as classifiers of Werech, Hedge, Hedgen, Ju, and Bean, which are all reversed, looking away from the singer of the reader. In case of the word boot, taboo, the classifier fish is in the right direction, but the 4 phonetic signs B, the quail, U, and the T-bread are in the reverse order. So it's a very nice play with the signs and the bad meaning. Let us now switch to the last part, visual aesthetics in relation to cursive writing. In respect to the inventory of signs, I can only focus a few ideas. I would like to begin with the example of the face, origin for visual perception, and one of the rare examples of Egyptian representations in frontality. Nadine Gressler has recently published her interesting research about concepts of face and perception in CS 148. Emotions, she said, are not part of the concept as conveyed in the modern use of faces for emoticons, for example. But normally hair, eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and the beard are to be seen in detailed hieroglyphs, while the sign can also be reduced to the shape in relief. Here are some examples from the Old and the New Kingdom. In cursive hieroglyphs, the face usually has got no details inside, sometimes only lines, dots, or an abbreviation hook. The round or oval shape and simple lines for ears, big or quite small, and for the beard are enough for identification. Because of the numerous and multiple use of the sign in combination with vertical and horizontal signs, the stroke and the hour and so on, the variety of forms is great among hieratic texts. But it's interesting that the beard as a symbol for the status of the person remains always part of the hieratic forms. My next example is man and woman. The real bodily forms are idealized in these statues, which are expressing status and gender. The gestures, colors of the skin, hair, makeup, necklaces, cloth, or naked body parts. Everything is distinguished and prototypical. Reduced to hieroglyphs, one shows normal people sitting on the ground, not on chairs, normally, but their hair, the partial nakedness, and the male arms, in contrary to the hidden female arms, are markers, just as in the case of Rahotep and his wife Nofret. What happens in cursive forms? You know, the reduction goes on. The hair of the woman and the active arms of the man are still prominent, while stronger abbreviations reduce the sign to a squatting person, and the gender is distinguished only through a diacritic dot here. Asking for visual aesthetics of the prototype man sign A1, we can see that the sitting man in his detailed form gives still a good visual impression of male activity. Here the first line of the paleography of Möller. But while the scribes applied different solutions for drawing the arms from dynasty 5 to 18, and then abandoned this kind almost exclusively. The small abbreviated form shows only back and leg, I assume. Looking for women, the papyrus of in Turin contains charming little pictures of women in different circumstances. First, the normal woman in comparison with a choice of hieratic abbreviations from our database. Second, the pregnant woman who is very appropriately drawn, whereas in hieratics the sign partly takes on the form of the similar sign of the tired man. Third, this fine drawing of a woman shows the special hairdress of divine maternity, say the vulture headdress, a newborn child in her arms, and some dots under her legs. This combines the sign of the woman giving birth with the sign of maternity with the boy or the child in the arms already. Now, moving on to the birds. Not only the hieroglyphic pictures are often real artworks of drawing, the cursive signs too show the skillfulness of a scribe. Only a few lines for the body, the characteristic beak, and something behind the head here are enough to identify the hieratic sign of the Arch bird. And you can also identify easily the realistic bird, the northern bald ibis. Tabitha Kraus recently analyzed the bird signs in the hieratic literary Berlin papyri from the Middle Kingdom. It is to be published only in a few weeks online. She tried to distinguish the single strokes of beak, head, breast, back, feathers, tail, and legs of several bird signs with the aim to describe the signs and to compare them with one another. The first question is if the strokes the scribe used could have been developed from the appearance of an original animal, or if the detailed hieroglyph was needed as pattern. It is difficult to decide, but since most of the scribes only knew hieratic and were not concerned with detailed hieroglyphic inscriptions, I guess, it could be that they formed the signs as a copy of what they saw in nature and not on a temple wall or tomb decoration. The most striking feature of the Aleph sign is the head and beak of the vulture. But in the hieratic form of the Middle Kingdom, the line is shifted to the left, being positioned above the breast. You can see here in this sign. And in the abbreviated form, it is completely missing, and the neck and the strong legs become more prominent here in this sample. Comparing very small birds, first the swallow, reading well. In hieratic, you can see that the head is missing. Two parallel lines are for breast and back. Below are the feet and the prominent tail feathers of the swallow. So the hieratic sign looks sometimes like a quadruped animal. The sparrow below, as classifier for small and bad, does not have such a tail. Therefore, the lines for breast and back meet in a rounded end, which is typical for this sign. Also, this bird needs no head in hieratic. Very similar to the swallow, the hieratic falcon gets also prominent tail feathers and misses a head, but he's more upright than the swallow and gets a baseline marking his long claws. Of course, we should not forget that the unambiguous reading or understanding of a hieratic sign comes out of the context and the combination with phonetic signs or classifiers. So the perception of a single sign is always influenced by the simultaneous understanding of the text. One last example should be the ark bird, whose natural model has been discussed by Tabitha Kraus. Is it the cormorant with its typical curved neck and long tail feathers, the Indian darter with a longer tail and smaller head, or the reed cormorant? The sign in cursive hieroglyphs from the 18th dynasty on the left is as clear as in hieratic of the 12th dynasty, these samples, or the 22nd dynasty here in the logo of our Akku project. The winding shape of the neck and the long tail feathers are decisive. Another outcome of Tabitha Kraus' master thesis is the presentation of 8 common basic forms used for different hieratic bird signs, as you can see on this graphic table. Sorry. The basic forms differ mainly in the form of the feet or basic line, then in the back line, and in the end in the form of the head, beak, and further attributes. The last two signs here are completely varying in hieroglyphs and in nature, but differ only as regards one additional line marking the short wings here of the fledgling. In the end, it's really not of interest which kind of bird the fledgling is, but it's a matter of fact are the small feathers, small arms. As I mentioned in the beginning, the inventory of signs in hieroglyphs as well as in cursive scripts is worth thinking about. The choice of artifacts from the household, insignia of the court or temple, any kinds of animals and their parts, landscape patterns, and farmer and hunting activities show us a lot of the world of the ancient Egyptians and of their capability to abstract from the real world to graphic characters. Concerning the aesthetics, it is valuable to have a closer look to this admirable papyrus made for Ka. Here, from right to left, you see the lion's head, the newborn antelope, the young birds hungry or in the nest below. These are graphic masterpieces. In the form of the scarabs, you can feel the roundness of the body, and the slightly different trees have many single branches and leaves. The scribe liked to draw difficult signs. Instead of these nice zoological studies, he could have used the abbreviation line or the animal's tail as classifier, but he preferred to present the animals quite realistically, from right the giraffe, the male and the female cat, as well as a Penu mouse. In the Book of the Dead of Nebket, also from the 18th dynasty, the scribe added a very nice drawing of a Weneshu canet. I like it very much. I promised in the abstract also to talk about layout and graphic design, but this topic would need a separate lecture, I learned in the meantime. I can summarize with these wonderful examples of aesthetically and functionally well executed sources. So, for example, the famous logbook from the time of Cheops, or the hieratic clay tablets from the Oasis Balad from the 6th dynasty. You all know the copy of the King's Letter in the Berlin Papyrus of Sinur, and the numbered medical papyrus, Ebers with columns and red and black ink. The early BD papyri here, the one of Nu in the British Museum, or the other one from Kha, which gives us different writing or script types with color here for Osiris and with fine lines on the other side. Of course, the miscellaneous papyri from the 19th dynasty, the Dream Book with these very interesting columns for the single lines, the calendar of lucky and unlucky days, and many others. Last but not least, the late and long BD papyri from Elsayed times. Stephen Quirke and me liked them very much. They were the beginning of our cooperation. Here the one of Hor, which is still without vignettes, but shows a hierarchy of lines. And the one of the lady Jachtes Nacht, made with a male figure for the deceased in several nice vignettes, but also interesting columns here with the God's determinative as a marker of the line. Just to name and show only a few layouts which are very exceptional. The ancient layout elements, all in all, I think are nearly the same as they are in the methods of graphic design considerations demanded today. I have listed a few here from modern texts, so filling the space regularly and with respect to symmetry, we know it, balancing text and pictures, using a hierarchy of lines and script formats, understanding the function and effect of colors and writing types, taking advantage of texture and material, following the function for the addressee or for oneself. Today, this is called a branding. Yeah. And of course, respecting the audience or the addressee and their culture and knowledge. Yeah, and respecting my audience, I would like to thank you now for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ursula. That was a wonderful reminder of the aesthetics that goes through all the scripts and whichever script we happen to be focused on. It will be interesting also to be thinking during our conference, not only of hieroglyphs and hieratic, but thinking out to demotic, the more cursive forms in each period. We have a few minutes left just for any questions. If anyone has something that they would like to put to Ursula. Hany, you have a point you'd like to raise.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Ursula. It was a wonderful, brilliant lecture. Thank you so much. I learned personally a lot of things. I'm just interested in the differences between Sikha, which you translated in certain context as a letter or as writing as well, and with also sesh in mind, and the Rosetta sesh to be literally meaning writing. On the Rosetta Stone, it was written sesh in midun nisher and also sesh in sha'id, and he didn't use sesh for the Greek languages. He used sekhai in hawi nibwiyu. So here there is a big difference between sikha and sesh. So can you like, I know it's a difficult topic, but sikha it's related to remember mostly. Sesh related to the combination between a picture and writing at the same time. But how you can feel the differences between sesh and sikha?
So I think the pronunciation or the letters, if you read secha or sesh, this is a question of research history. So in some countries you read sesh, and in Germany now secha is.
I think the question is maybe more on the trilingual stones in the Decree of Memphis, on the Rosetta Stone. For example, you have sechai with ch. And so when they refer to demotics, they call it sesh or secha. But with the Greek, they don't use the word. I think that was Hany's question more. So, and then secha should be about remembering. It's a really interesting difference. They decide no, Greek script is not demotic or Egyptian, it's not sesh somehow, or secha. I think that was the question.
Okay.
Did you have any thought about that? Why on the Ptolemaic decrees, they might have just chosen a completely different word when they're talking about writing of the Greeks?
No, I have no idea in the moment, sorry.
Maybe that's something we can explore later in the session. Any other questions for?
Yes, so I have a very quick question. Thank you, Ursula. This was great. I really enjoyed it. And it made me think all these wonderful signs, indeed, especially in hieratic and their visuality, made me think instead to the bad hieratic. Lately, in my course of hieratic, we were reading one of the oracular amuletic decrees, and even the students were saying, "Oh my God, what a bad scribe!" And I was trying to still see some aesthetics, even in those signs that look really all the same and doesn't seem like the scribe is trying to differentiate them. I wonder what you think about it. Do you think we could find some sort of aesthetics also from an emic perspective in that kind of text, which is supposed to be an important text anyway, of protection, for instance, and but is written in a way that, you know, it doesn't look really so wonderful, let's say.
Yeah, so this is a question of calligraphy. No? When did they use a very nice calligraphic form of the signs, and when it is not necessary? So I think aesthetically, from the visual point of view, is on the one side, and on the other side, the correctness of the text. So an oracular decree or an amulet text or even a book of the dead. So it should work. It should have the power through the text. And there is also an economic factor. So when you have to write very long texts, you cannot take much time for every single sign. But when someone is writing very small but very a regular line, so it is also aesthetic. Even maybe it's difficult to read, but yeah, it was a script of the time. So we should not transport or take our aesthetic quality markers maybe to these regular decrees. So if one got such an amulet or a decree, he was very happy, I think, and he put it on his breast, and for him it was never, I think.
I agree. Thank you.
I think we've probably run to the end of our time for this session, but I'd like to thank Ursula again for setting us on the ground of inquiry and keeping alert to all of those different areas, particularly those lists of all the functions, these lists of the different factors involved. The complexity of our task is quite daunting, but very challenging and exciting, I think, as well. So thank you again for the wonderful keynote speech.
Thank you.
We look forward to people picking up maybe on these topics when we move into the next session.
Hello, everyone. Very happy to be here. It's a pleasure and an honor to be chairing the first session of this exciting conference. As you will have seen, we have a block of questions at the end of each session. So save your questions for the 20 minutes at the end, and we'll be having the three presentations in a row to begin with. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Marina Sartori, a PhD student at the University of Basel, working in the project Life Histories of Theban Tombs. She's also part of the epigraphic team of the Swiss mission in Sheikh Abd al-Qurna since 2016, with a focus on painting techniques. Her paper today is entitled An Art Historical Perspective on New Kingdom Monumental Hieroglyphs. So please go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and also for the invitation. I'm really actually extremely grateful to the organizers also for creating such a wonderful occasion to discuss about the aesthetics of Egyptian hieroglyphs. This topic is actually very close to my heart, and in fact is one of the foci of my dissertation at the University of Basel. As the title implies, I will then today proceed to examine the reciprocal influence that script and figure exercise on each other, but mostly on an art historical from an art historical point of view, and in the specific context of New Kingdom Theban tombs. I will do this in 4 major steps. That is, first, an introduction to the theoretical and methodological aspects, then more in detail how the nature of the 18th dynasty aesthetics differs from the Ramesside ones, and finally through the case study of a very simple pictorial unit, the offering table, which, however, is quite emblematic from various points of view. A basic axiom of ancient Egyptian visual culture is that script and figure overlap to the point that they can be exchanged in various contexts. They can assume a bimodality, which lets a picture work as a figure and at the same time as part of an inscription. This axiom has been thus recently very clearly defined by Venue in the following way. So Egyptian hieroglyphs can be characterized as figurative because they depict the realia of the pharaonic universe in the same manner as the figurative parts. Indeed, the unity of the two experiences of writing and painting has almost the cognitive roots. We know that the aforementioned linguistic root, Zecha, can encompass exactly both experiences of drawing, painting, and related words of both fields. And this is actually parallel, a combination that has parallels in cultures from all over the world. Also from the Mayan to the ancient Greeks to the Chinese culture. Whereas this unity seems to be immediately recognizable in an ancient Egyptian context, it has, however, often been taken for granted, so that no one has actually undertaken a systematic comparison between how realia are graphically depicted as signs and how they are graphically depicted as figurative elements in the context of a figurative scene, let's say. The seminal work by Fisher, often cited as the basic source to describe the ancient Egyptian unity of script and figure, is in fact the only one to contain a short paragraph comparing the graphic execution of objects as signs and as part of scenes. In this case, he brings the example of how the scribal equipment is depicted as a sign and how in various figurative depictions from the Old Kingdom. His conclusion, however, is that, as we can read here, is that basically depictions are quite conservative, and specifically hieroglyphs are even less open to change than their figurative counterparts. We will see later that this is not always exactly the case. Before him, a work by Nina Davis, programmatically called Picture Writing in Ancient Egypt, with the focus exactly on picture, had indeed attempted more extensive comparisons between single hieroglyphs and their figurative counterparts. Her purpose was to show how hieroglyphs shared the same careful execution as figures, to the point that they were to be considered as artistic achievements on their own. Combining these two approaches, my purpose, therefore, was to investigate to what extent is the affirmation true that script and figure overlap from a purely graphic and artistic point of view. That is, to what extent objects are portrayed in script in the same way as they are portrayed in figurative depictions. The main questions can be, therefore, summarized. What is the relationship between written and figurative representation from the graphic point of view? I try to answer this by analyzing script and figure as a part of one indiscrete pictorial system and looking instead for single graphic differences in their rendition. And of course, since changes do not happen on their own, but they are the result of the agency of people behind them, this can also bring us to understand better what kind of approaches did the painters undertake when painting a single pictorial object in a linguistic context that is as part of an inscription or as a part of a figurative context. My dataset involved 25 New Kingdom Theban tombs from different parts of the necropolis. Single pictorial units from three main pictorial registers, that is monochrome and polychrome hieroglyphs and scene details, were analyzed and compared on the basis of a number of parameters. Specifically, I will focus today on the parameters of iconicity, color, and size. Everything, all this data, of course, converged into a FileMaker Pro database, which counts now over 2,000 units. So when looking at 18th dynasty hieroglyphic aesthetics, indeed, one is astonished by how well the various renditions of a single object resemble each other in the level of detail, even in the colors, size being the only differentiating element in that scene details often are bigger than hieroglyphs. However, when going more into detail, already the analysis of how colors are used suggests a different approach to script and figure. Here, for example, only two colors have been used for both units, so for the polychrome hieroglyph and for the scene detail. However, they are different. In the hieroglyph, a rosa beige acts as a background, while a blue stripe is used for the baseline. Whereas in the scene detail, the same hilltops present no such base, but has instead another element of color in the alternation of red and white dots. So whereas it is true that actually most often polychrome hieroglyphs really have the same amount of color as the scene, it doesn't mean that they necessarily use color in the same way. Also, the comparison of the degree of iconicity presented by single pictorial objects can bring to interesting conclusions. In fact, one would normally expect that a higher iconicity in the scene details, supposedly the pictorial elements par excellence. However, as a simple unit as the human eye usually presents a higher degree of iconicity as polychrome monumental hieroglyph than as scene detail. In the early 18th dynasty of Thutmose III, this is characterized by the red inner corners. We know that these red inner corners actually appear also in the scenes up until the Middle Kingdom, but this is never the case in New Kingdom Theban tombs. So there is already, again, a sort of differentiation. Nor is this higher iconicity for the polychrome hieroglyph just a case, because starting from the reign of Thutmose IV, we find another way of expressing a higher iconicity for the same unit. In this case, however, with the distinction between a pupil and iris. Again, something which is never found in figurative scenes. Finally, as mentioned, the size is also an important parameter to investigate the relationship between script and figure. First of all, it is indeed true that normally signs present reduced dimensions in comparison to the corresponding figurative objects. However, a few cases show that polychrome hieroglyphs can also have the same dimensions, or even surpass the dimensions of the rest of the decorative elements. And when this happens, it is clear that a certain focus is put on them so that they clearly stand out in comparison to the rest of the decoration. Secondly, it is also remarkable that size does not influence the level of iconicity of a unit, meaning the smaller the unit, the lesser iconicity or the lesser details. Actually, on the contrary, we have cases of miniature hieroglyphs here, for example, displayed, that show the same amount of care and detail in 1/3 of the size of normal hieroglyphs. All of this, however, evolves in the Ramesside period. The major change consists in the abandonment of monumental polychrome hieroglyphs in favor of a simplified type, which uses a reduced color palette and presents no fine lines nor outlines. Polychrome monumental hieroglyphs are to be found only in very specific Theban tombs, often belonging to scribes or draftsmen. For example, there are quite a few tombs in Deir el-Medina, but only up to the reign of Ramses II. So here we have the examples of polychrome hieroglyphs from Ramesside tombs. Even when present, however, it is clear that these polychrome hieroglyphs, these polychrome monumental hieroglyphs, show a sort of awkwardness. In particular, this is evident in the uncomfortable proportions, as well as again in the use of thick line strokes, which are instead very far away from the thin strokes, line strokes from the 18th dynasty. In some cases, it is even possible to track down, again to the reign of Thutmose IV, this shift away from the density and iconicity of the script. In the case of the hilltops, even happens the opposite of what Fisher had described. So the Ramesside script version, which is this, is actually graphically less conservative, and it distances itself from the figurative depiction, which is this. Whereas the figurative depictions stay more conservative, more consistent in respect to the older versions of the sign. Of course, again, I don't want to give agency to the script. The changes clearly reflect a different approach on part of the painters, and possibly also changes in their training. A similarly interesting case is the one below, the pictorial unit of the seated god, which again undergoes a gradual simplification, only to receive, almost as a counter reaction in the Ramesside examples, other details never found before, such as here the colored collar, which in this case brings it closer to the respective Ramesside figurative depiction. This osmosis between script graphics and figure graphics, therefore, is a constantly evolving process, and each case needs to be analyzed per se and in its context. If it is usually not so easy to distinguish which pictorial system influences which, sometimes it is more evident. Coming back to the pictorial unit, the scribal equipment that has already also been shown by Professor Verhoeven, we can see that in the Ramesside tombs, it becomes extremely common to depict the instruments of the deceased profession almost exactly in the same way as the script does. This, again, is quite a change from the 18th dynasty tombs, in which there is no great overlapping and usually only the scribal palette is depicted with the two inkwells and the other details that are instead often actually always omitted in the Ramesside versions of both the sign and of the figurative depiction. How complex it can be to analyze the reciprocal influence of script and figure is shown in particular by the following case study, the Gardner earthwork. This is an extremely common pictorial unit found literally everywhere. It's defined as bread loaf on reed mat. On the top, we can see a number of possible paleographic variants of the sign. The monochrome usually showing a simple oval bread, sometimes cut in the middle, whereas the polychrome sign presents the lozenge-shaped bread with inner details, which we could compare with the Gardner X2. What we find in figurative depictions, however, is not always comparable. The most typical form of the bread found in offering tables actually does not correspond for sure to the elegant form found in polychrome hieroglyphs, but it has instead other types of details, such the lines on the top and in the middle. However, again, starting from the time of Thutmose IV, we do find also in figurative depictions some examples that show a more direct connection to the polychrome monumental version of the sign. The oval bread, instead, with a simple cut in the middle, is nowhere to be found in the private context of the 18th dynasty. I would like to stress this out because actually in the Ramesside period, in a temple context, we will find also this type of paleographic variant, so to say, reflected in figurative depictions, for example, from the temple of Ramesses II in Abydos. But until now, in the 18th dynasty, there is a sort of overlapping, but also not a complete overlapping between the different types of renditions. In the Ramesside period, the already mentioned the simplification of the script occurs, whereas the reduced polychrome hieroglyphs might still be comparable somehow with the one of the older figurative versions. In a number of tombs, painters start to explore completely new ways of depicting both bread loaves and reed mat in a way which is completely autonomous from the script. At the same time, a more naturalistic look, see the flexible ends here of the reed mat, which are a bit, as I said, more close to reality, and more simple. See the white circular bread with no inner details, which are again different from the types that we found during the 18th dynasty. So in this case, there is really a disjunction between the two modes. From these excursions, then we could sum up the following points. Yes, script and figure do originally share the same graphic origin and vocabulary, but the influence they exercise on each other is constantly renegotiated and needs to be assessed case for case. In fact, whereas they osmotically interact, they seem otherwise to follow autonomous paths, as exemplified by the paleographic evolution from 18th dynasty to Ramesside period. Of course, I repeat again as a disclaimer, these changes do not happen on their own, but they reflect changes in the personal approaches of the painters to the iconic material, and as well their will to experiment. Unfortunately, there was not enough time to go more into this topic, but I hope that for now, this overview about how script and figure interact was clear, and I look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much indeed for this wonderful presentation. Some really striking visual details there. Again, we'll take the questions at the end of the session. So without further ado, I will move on to our second presentation, which is given collaboratively by three scholars. The first is Andrea Paschi of the Politecnico di Milano, who's doing his PhD there. He's also part of the team led by Corinna Rossi, surveying the site of al Dabadib in the Quirke oasis. And he is collaborating with the Egyptian Museum in Turin on the new display in the Cairo Egyptian Museum as 3D model expert. The second speaker is Todd Shimoda, of Thinkers Tools Incorporated, holds a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. He is the president of Thinker Tools, which is a non-profit corporation dedicated to reducing educational inequalities. And the third presenter is Stefano Natrella of the Brera Academy of Fine Arts in Milan. He has worked for more than 30 years in the field of photography, both research and applied, and he is currently teaching photography at the Brera Academy of Fine Arts. The title of their paper is Ancient Egyptian Hieroglyphs Perception Through Embodied Cognition and Pictorial Realism Towards an Ontology of Active Imagination in Ancient Egypt. Please go ahead, the screen is yours.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for this chance to present our work, even if in its early stage. And today I'm talking on behalf of my colleagues and friends, Mr. Todd Shimoda and Stefano Natrella. Well, we are trying to propose an interdisciplinary approach to the language of ancient Egyptian hieroglyph, which is not aimed to the perfect, let's say, grammatical comprehension of the text, or at least not only, but rather to the virtual comprehension of the way in which ancient Egyptians used to relate to the text itself and how we could try to imitate them. I think that this caption from Schrödinger could well express this kind of mental approach, since it's not so much to see what no one has yet seen, but to think what nobody has yet thought about that which everybody sees. Every comment, suggestion, or whatsoever will be really welcome and appreciated at the end of the presentation or contacting us by email. Well, first of all, as it is widely known, spoken language developed roughly between 200,000 and 50,000 years before current era, in a period in which humans started creating art, probably music, and already have started using tools and things like this. Spoken language allowed first humans to have ideas survive death, to express nuanced emotion, and in a word, it allowed the birth of societies. But nevertheless, it was necessary another, let's say, brilliant invention, that of written language. It is known that canonical writing system appeared in Egypt and Sumer around 3000 before current era and later on in between 900 and 600 in Mesoamerica. But we should not forget that around 36,000 before current era, first human has started to produce amazing example of rock art. we suggest that even if the first canonical writing system appeared in Egypt, we could, or maybe we should, consider even this kind of depiction as a primeval form of writing. We argued that this depiction in prehistorical caves can be considered as pictogram ante litteram, and we will explain why. We can compare these images to the Egyptian hieroglyphs if we consider an hieroglyph as an image able to represent a precise thought or idea. Since it takes place within a precise space, any image possesses a peculiar clearness. In fact, its bare appearance is enough to make us comprehend its sense, and often there's no need of any kind of cultural mediation. In other words, signified and signifiers almost overlap in this kind of images and representation. The most fascinating peculiarity of this writing is the fact that each pictogram or logogram could be interpreted as a collection of ideas resulting from a complex process of classification. Visual arts such the pictorial representation in a Chauvet cave we saw a while ago was practiced long ago before the evolution of written language, and likely the combining of art and concepts resulted in this pictogram. Hieroglyphs were often visual representation of something that needed no word to describe it. For example, a pictogram of fire was most likely a fire, as in this case. Ideogram, as I said, are a collection of ideas a pictogram might represent. For example, different words related to the fire are written with the final classifier of a fire. And we can notice from this slide that the relationship between signified and signifier is quite weak in our modern language, in which a codified system of letter is completely abstract and it stands for things. In ancient Egypt, on the contrary, the pictogram for fire was really entangled in the life of the society, and it was an embodied representation of the object for how it was perceived by the senses. Almost the same thing clearly occurred for Chinese ideograms, which likely developed after the influence of Egyptian on Sumer language. But for the same peculiarity of being a direct representation of the object, the meaning of the writing could be misunderstood. And it is in this gap between the sign and its meaning that takes place the active imagination. This faculty that we can define also as cognitive imagination is crucial in order to understand ancient civilization, and I suggest modern days too. So let's consider some examples, which are not surprisingly regarding the death realm. Well, let's consider one of the terms which indicate death, many. Literally, this term means mooring or something of that nature, but when combined to the pictograph of a mummy, its meaning is transferred upon a metaphorical layer, which can be interpreted as the final mooring or death. In China, it would not make sense in ancient China, and not only because in ancient China anyone spoke ancient Egyptian language, but because the image of the sarcophagus has anything to do with the Chinese mindset and culture. In China, they combine two pictograms, one of the skeletal remains of a person and the other of a living person kneeling next to the remains. Perhaps the imagery of the kneeling person represented a formal burial practice or a natural expression of grief or something of that nature. But it has to be noted that around the 4th or 5th century, Chinese writing started to spread in Japan, likely originally imported through Korea. The standardized forms of Chinese character known in Japan as kanji were hence adapted for Japanese word when possible, but there wasn't always a direct correspondence, and there were some Japanese words with no equivalent. It's something that still happens in Japan, where kanji are taught without any link to their former meanings. They are memorized and taught just as some strokes, just as signifiers. In the case of death, for example, a pictogram for death may not have been a person kneeling next to the skeleton remains if it was first written in Japan. Indeed, prior to importing Buddhism and kanji, Shinto belief of death included a reminder of the short cycle of life. At death, the person kami, or spirit energy, was released, and it was celebrated as much as mourned. So a pictogram of this concept would have looked very different from the Chinese character for death. Another interesting example refers to the use of the same classifier for different words. I prefer the term classifier than determinative because I agree that more than determining a meaning of a word, the final ideogram do add a classification which is really useful to understand Egyptian point of view, and I think that it is really useful to comprehend the process of the active imagination. And here in this example, the role of active imagination, I think it's quite striking. All these terms means tomb, as you may know, but each one symbolizes it in a different way. In the first example, the tomb is written as a het, the horizon. Then in the second, the tomb is linked to the fact of being pure, wabet. While in the third, the parallel with the above said term for death as the final mooring is quite striking, being tomb considered written as the union of a canal and a boat mast, as a metaphorical final journey. And the last word to indicate a tomb, khat, is written with a papyrus clamp, likely connected with the fact that the papyrus symbolized the life arising along the Nile. We stated that active imagination is crucial to understand ancient cultures, but what does it mean to observe actively? Let's consider a landscape. Any of us bear in its mind an image of a landscape which may be composed by trees, or houses, buildings, hills, seaside, or whatsoever. And we could begin to zoom in and begin to deconstruct all these elements, each tree in its branches, leaves, its trunk, and so on, until arriving at the atoms which form every object. But would it be really useful to comprehend what a landscape is? What makes a landscape durable in our mind? I think that a powerful image consists exactly of that, of the representation of the real and immediate nature of a thing. For ancient Egyptian, for example, a simple shape deriving from a sycamore tree was able to contain and hold all the meaning connected to the different species of tree. But the issue is, how does it happen? Once again, we suggest that active imagination is responsible for death. To catch the meaning of this active element, we should go back to the ancient Greek world, and especially to Plato Timaeus. Here it is said that a sort of internal light exists inside the eyes, and going out from this, it merges with the external light, producing what we define as sight. Interestingly enough, this sight is produced by similarity of parts, in the sense that it is the eye that in a way produce and create what it is seeing. Modern science has then demonstrated that this assumption was in fact real, in that the eye has more a projecting function than a receptive one. It is interesting to know that Plato even suggested that dreams were the consequences of the emotional calm state of this internal light. But still, on a scientific point of view, the cognitive neuroscience studies support theories of embodied semantics, suggesting that neural mechanisms of perception and movement coordination also influence the processing of abstract information, such as the language production and comprehension. This means that seeing a sarcophagus and a person kneeling next to remain evokes an embodied reaction, just as the seeing of a realistic or even symbolic drawing of a skeleton and a person kneeling next to it. Let's go back to another example and try to see it a little bit in depth. We say that the abstract word man, has meaning only if it is recognized and if our conceptual system attaches meaning to it. If I weren't an English speaker, I would never understand the meaning of that combination of abstract strokes. Something similar clearly happened with hieroglyphs and ideograms, but here there are some crucial differences. First of all, one doesn't need any kind of knowledge of ancient Egyptian to understand that these pictograms stand for man. And something similar happened with the Chinese character, with the Chinese radical for man. Clearly, things aren't always so simple, and exists a lot of different hieroglyphs with no apparent relation with our reality. So how could we at least try to understand something of ancient Egyptian writing system and art? Well, science and philosophy give us almost the same answer. One of the most fascinating points of today's scientific research is that it's giving us answer that philosophy had already gave us, even if in different terms. Well, our conceptual system can disengage from our sensory model system. And with this separation, we can imagine how the world was in the past and how it could be in the future. And language in all its different forms amplify this ability. It's quite interesting to note how David Hume defined man as a creature mildly governed by the imagination. Not so differently, Henry Corbin, following the Islamic philosophy of Sohrawardi and Ibn Arabi, argues that imagination is crucial to the understanding of life and death. And Corbin digs a little deeper and he focuses on where imagination takes place. He refers to what the Shiite mystic defined as the mundus imaginalis, or alam al-mithal, which is an intermediate word between the sensory one and the pure abstract one. Imagination, hence, takes place within this mundus imaginalis, making, in a way, more concrete the pure abstract forms. As I said, the aim of this work is to try to study ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs in the light of the notion of mundus imaginalis as the place within which the content of Meidun Eger take place. The first operation we need to do is to detach figures from their symbolic meaning. What I'm going to show may upset some of you, and I do agree with you because I'd be upset too, but later on I hope it will be clear what we are proposing. So let's compare these two pictures, which are apparently totally and completely different, and I think they are. But even if the solar symbol is radically different in each of these images, within the realm of the mundus imaginalis, its image is the same. It acts on behalf of an archetype. The Egyptian hieroglyph that stand for sun with rays could be simplified in this Priyamana version. And we should keep in mind that what we see merges with what we think about it and what our imagination in a way contain about it. And that happens by means of the faculty of the fantasia, what ancient Greek called fantasia. It should be noted that the former meaning of this word was quite deeper and more complex than the modern day. In fact, it comes from the root faina, which means to show. In other words, what we see is what our mind wants to see, or better yet, pretend to see. So let's now apply this concept to the images we saw just before. We could summarize these images in their basic element, which is seen and interpreted from two different points of view. It should be clear now that these images, as much as they are totally different, are a little bit closer than what we thought. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, and particularly those representing complex ideas or metaphors, are evidence of this process of active imagination, which makes abstract concepts more concrete and actual. And in conclusion, we propose that we should try to train our eyes and our mind to see and comprehend the pure images of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, stripped of their contents, in order to go deeper in the comprehension of their former meaning. Thank you for your attention, and here are our email address for any comments, suggestions, or whatsoever you like. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for this very thought-provoking presentation. Again, I'm sure there'll be questions and discussions afterward. For now, let's move on to the third speaker of this session, Nikki van de Beek from Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz. She is a PhD candidate in the project Early Concepts of Human and Nature, Universal Specific Interchanged, and she is working on developing digital methods tailored to Egyptological research. Her paper today is titled "The Devil is in the Fishtail, Visual Writing and Written Visuals in Private Tomb Scenes." Please go ahead.
So first of all, of course, a very warm thank you to the organizers of this conference for providing this platform to speak and make it so accessible to everyone. This is really appreciated. So today I want to talk about some aspects that I came across in my research. And my research is about landscape in ancient Egypt. On the one hand, what the actual landscape looked like, how we can reconstruct this, and on the other hand, how it was represented by the ancient Egyptians themselves, especially in private tomb scenes from the Old to the New Kingdom, so taking a large stretch of time, and to find out ultimately what concepts were behind these representations. So when we look at these images of landscape, in the Old Kingdom, we usually call these scenes of daily life. So we have the tomb owner here in what we would call a marshland scene, standing on a papyrus boat, and she is surrounded by all kinds of economic activities. And there is a hieroglyphic caption saying what she's doing, which is either viewing or traversing the marshlands. And if she was a man, she would be shown either spearing fish or fowling, but she's a woman, so she is sniffing papyrus. And so it's not just landscape, there's a lot going on. For example, there's cattle breeding, papyrus harvest, boat building, the catch is being returned. Canal where cattle is crossing. There's a hippo hunt going on and fishing activities. So all kinds of economic activities in this type of landscape. And the actual landscape elements are here shown in green, which is the water surrounding her with all its wildlife, the fish and the hippos and the crocodiles, and the papyrus stalks with different types of birds, but also, for example, a mongoose stealing a chick from a nest. So you have all this information contained in one wall, but then when you zoom in, for example, to this little detail here, you find this hippo giving birth, and a crocodile is already waiting to eat the little baby. And you can see that even today, this touches people as this white stain used to be a black stain where all the tourists were taking this scene, which is also, as it happens, at eye level. So there's a lot of things going on. We have the interesting thing is that we have a combination approach of what the ancient Egyptians themselves would call these activities, call these types of birds and animals, etc. So here we have 5th dynasty tomb of Hetepharachti, now in Leiden, originally from Saqqara, where he is said to be viewing the marshland and spearing fish. And this is exactly what you can see him doing. Oops, sorry. The fish, which in effect are a Nile perch and a tilapia, are neatly coming up to him in this big wave so he can spear them on his spear. And he's also on a papyrus boat and surrounded by what we would call marsh landscape. And this scene has been explained in many ways, for example, as providing food for the afterlife, as sport, as leisure, as something that only an elite person would be able to do, and more symbolic things such as controlling chaos and fertility, having to do with the tilapia that holds eggs in his mouth, in her mouth. But when we look at this, at the caption, then we see the way in which this word marshland is spelled. So it's spelled with 3 signs showing the rear end of a lion and 3 signs showing a canal. And this already says something about the type of marshland that's being that's meant. So we would call this the back swamps, and this has to do with the nature of the ancient Egyptian landscape. That when the Nile inundation subsided, the water would be retained in these back swamps, and you could use that for all these economic activities of fishing and fowling and spearing fish. And the word mehit, so what he is spearing is this Nile perch and tilapia that we saw, but mehit is beautifully spelled with 3 determinatives showing in detail 3 different species of fish that we could recognize as a mullet, a pufferfish, and a catfish. So different types of fish than the ones he's actually spearing, but these could be the fish that are depicted in the water underneath him. In fact, this band of decoration is unfinished in the tomb. And Simon Thuot, who is also present here tonight, has argued that there are 2 words for fish, and that one word is rem is more used to mean fish as opposed to birds. And this word mehit is used more as fish used for consumption. And indeed, when you look at other scenes in which this word mehit is used, then they definitely used for consumption. So this is interesting, this complementarity between the text and image, and the hieroglyphs being detailed images, and maybe the images being large hieroglyphs, which has already been proposed. And you can also see this in the tomb of Kagemni, where there's again a marshland scene of cattle crossing, and a little calf is being used to lead the cattle. And the word for cattle has a determinative, which in fact is also a herd of cattle. So it's double, it's complementary. And I would say this complementarity also extends into space. So for example, in this tomb in Aswan, we have this little fella who is represented on a pillar, but in fact he is presenting incense to the tomb owner. And we also know, of course, of the statues that are being dealt with in this way, and that form part of the imagery. So our own division between text, image, and sculpture and architecture may be a little bit different for the ancient Egyptians. So what I use in my thesis is prototype theory, and we've already touched upon it a little bit, that in cognitive linguistics we have this idea that semantic categories reflect conceptual categories. So if you have a word for something in your language, it means you also have a concept for this in your mind. And prototype theory is a graded theory of categorization where some members of a conceptual category are more central than others. So you could say that a dog would be a better, more central example for the category pet than a snake. And I guess the ancient Egyptians would agree with us, but this is not necessarily true in every culture and every time. And Orly Goldwasser has argued that we already have inherent in the hieroglyphs this kind of semantic classification system, because the determinatives were used to classify the words that they accompanied, which has already been mentioned before as well. So these prototypes, they come in different levels, as it were. So you would have the basic category of animal, and underneath you would have dogs and birds, and underneath the birds you would have the different types of birds or species. And this of course can differ for different geographical locations and cultures as well. So maybe a penguin is to us not a very central type of bird, but if you were living in Antarctica, then it would be. So what I'm trying to do as part of my research is to look at these emic categories. So how did the ancient Egyptians categorize and classify their natural environment? And so what do we do when we have an image, again, in the tomb of Hany, of trees? The trees are a bit generic here, depicted with the leaves and here without leaves. And we have all kinds of birds in these trees. And how do you say what kind of bird this is? So two are very recognizable because they have this comb. So everyone who's been to Egypt probably knows this is a hoopoe. But the other type, how do we say that this is a golden oriole? And this is by comparing it to other scenes, for example, here in the tomb of Hany in Beni Hassan, where we have the same bird depicted, but with color. And there is a hieroglyphic sign saying this is a genu. So we recognize this as a golden oriole, and we say a genu equals a golden oriole. But this is saying that we use maybe our modern Linnaean classification to build a taxonomy. So when we say the Medum geese, these must be red-breasted geese because they look very much like red-breasted geese. And in fact, Romilio has argued that this has to be a now extinct species because according to our modern criteria, some things are off and these should not be said to be the same species. But I disagree. I would say we should look at the emic categories that were being used. Then there is the aspect of realism. So if we go back to this landscape scene in the tomb of Hany, we can see these little sub-registers that the Egyptians very much liked. And we can see goats eating from the foliage at the top of the tree, which is not real, right? But then when we compare it to other scenes, we find that there were goats, in fact, climbing into the trees because the leaves at the top of the trees are, of course, the greenest. And when we compare it to, for example, the argan trees in Morocco, we can see that goats can indeed climb trees. So we shouldn't just disregard what we see right away if it doesn't fit our idea of realism. And the same goes for these giant fish that I recently photographed in the tomb of Mehu in Saqqara. So you could say this is wishful thinking, but then in fact, some of these species can really become really large when they have enough fertile ground or water. So in looking at this type that we would call marshland scenes, we can see a sort of prototypical nature of the scene. So also in the Middle Kingdom, we have the same elements. So the tomb owner is standing on a boat on a body of water, and there are papyrus plants, and there are birds, and there are different animals represented. And often it's side by side that he is fowling and spearfishing. And then when we look at this type of marshland, 3 different words are used to denote this type of landscape. So there is the pehu that we saw before, denoting this sort of back swamp, but there's also the word sha'u, which uses this place where papyrus grows, basically, and seshu, which is a place where birds can nest. And indeed, inside these papyrus stalks, often there is a nest depicted with birds. Then when you zoom into this part above the door, you can see Khnumhotep catching waterfowl with a clap net over a pond. And there are 2 trees depicted with birds in them. So if you zoom in even more, and this is the detail that we're talking about, you can recognize by the leaves that this could be an acacia tree. And you can see again the hoopoe, and you can determine that these are female and male masked shrike, etc. So this attention to detail was apparently important to the ancient Egyptians, that even if it was on top of a wall that you couldn't see from a distance, the detailed depiction of these birds mattered. And another example from this tomb is a little African monarch butterfly, and then an African spoonbill, and even the little ribs inside his beak. So this is not even visible if you look at a photo of this type of bird. even those ribs are being depicted in a place where you wouldn't be able to see it if you were standing in front of it. And then this level of details is counteracted by certain trees that are so generic that you wouldn't be able to say what type of tree it is. And here again, we can see goats being fed by the trees and also being hung on trees when they were being slaughtered. But then in the tomb of Ineni, Ibn Tomb, he has a whole tree list. So here we can see the 5 trees depicted or mentioned on the right. And you can see that this tree kind of resembles the determinative for a deciduous tree, and that there's a different determinative that denotes palm trees, like the date palm and the doom palm. And then when you look at the Dar Medina tomb of Amenacht, on the left-hand side, Amenacht is shown with a doom palm, and on the left, his wife is kneeling down by a date palm. And when you look at the hieroglyphs, even the hieroglyphs or the determinatives have their own type. So there is a specific determinative for a doom palm and a specific sign for a date palm. Going back to these marshlands, I don't have time to show you many examples, but when you look at these different examples from the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom, you can find these different designations for marshland that we have seen before, and also the activities that you could do there, which is viewing or inspecting and traversing. And you can inspect the work of the field and the work of the Weha, the fishermen and fowlers, which is also interesting because this is one word. And we have seen that this fishing and fowling, it always took place next to each other. So in the minds of the Egyptians, this was perhaps one category. Yes, so what I do with my research is I include these landscape scenes, and then I record the captions, so the hieroglyphic captions, and also the visual elements that they contain. And then this system called NodeCode also lets me easily map the tombs in time and space. So I can add coordinates and I can add a dating. And then it's really easy to compare and select certain tombs and their visual images. And what it also lets me do is do automated network analysis or network visualization. So I can easily compare, for example, the terminology of these marshland scenes and compare them to each other across time and space. So yes, this was very briefly what I'm doing, and it would be really interesting for the paper to further research these aspects of this complementarity between text and image, how to find out what are the emic categories behind these images, and to look at this attention to detail and the realism or naturalism that is behind it, and also the encyclopedic nature of what is being depicted. So the need for the tomb owner to mention these different types of marshlands and to show the different types of fish. So yeah, thank you very much. That was my presentation in short.
Thank you very much indeed for this very, very clear presentation of, again, some wonderful visual materials and some striking connections between writing and images there. We now have about 20 minutes of questions. Well, I have questions really for everyone here. To begin with the last presentation, Nikki, I wondered if you could, do you have thoughts about that really striking level of detail that you mentioned, especially something as stylized as the fishing and fouling scenes, where the two Mona is very stereotypical, with a dress that hasn't changed for centuries, and presumably goes back to the Shendi kilt, going back to Old Kingdom royal prototypes, I would guess. Whereas on the other hand, you have that extremely rich, seemingly naturalistic level of detail for the nature depictions. Do you have any thoughts on that phenomenon?
Yeah, I think Linda Evans has also written about this, that indeed the people, and especially the socially important people, so the tomb owner and his family, etc., they are very formalized, and well, you have this decorum and everything. But especially in the natural environment that's being depicted, there is a great level of naturalism. So also in the what she has studied, the animal behavior that's being depicted, that's pretty realistic. So I don't have any enlightened thoughts about it as yet. It was just, it's when you start to work with these images, it's really striking. And when you start photographing the details of all these tombs in Egypt. And I was also really liking Marina's presentation, where she showed the hieroglyphs and the way the mountains and things are depicted. So yeah, I don't yet have an answer.
Well, I'll definitely be looking forward to reading your thoughts on that later on. So speaking of Marina's presentation, I wanted to ask you a question as well around the stylization that you demonstrated very clearly, going from the 18th dynasty and into the Ramesside period. Do you have thoughts about where does the inspiration for that come from? I mean, I immediately thought of hieratic or cursive hieroglyphic sign forms as a possible inspiration. Have you looked at that in more detail, whether there's a correlation or it's a separate development?
I didn't look precisely about the connection with hieratic, to be honest. I didn't delve too deep into that, but I can imagine that, yes, my point of view was more like that somehow there is this sort of knowledge that gets in a way lost, not because it gets lost, but because it's less practiced. And there is also the same happening, for example, also in royal tombs. Somehow the quality keeps decreasing in a way, whereas this is a very so to say snobbish judgment. But yes, I can imagine that it has to do with the different training of the painters. As I said at the beginning, it's definitely linked to a sort of disjunction between the people that may, according to me somehow, there seems to be a sort of disjunction between the painters that are responsible, for example, for the scenes, and the painters that are instead responsible for the inscriptions. And probably the painters that are responsible for the inscriptions are not trained anymore in the monumental polychrome type, and are instead much more familiar with the cursive scripts, like exactly hieratic. So maybe either there is a different division of the work, or there are less people who are trained in the monumental script, whereas and so it's a problem of less workforce available, so to say, less workforce which is specialized and is not anymore available. So I can imagine it's something related to this.
Yeah, I think that sounds very likely. Thank you. We have a question, Ahmed.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. In the lecture about the hieroglyphs, the classification, which was brilliant. Like I think all the lectures are brilliant. I wonder if there is a classification of the classifiers, or any of the scholars among you are doing this. That what you call a habitat or a determinative, well, the final hieroglyph, which is shared by, I mean, it can be an ideogram, it can be a phonogram, but the last one, or the one that you are using as a habitat or a classification, I wonder if there is a classification of that classifier. Like, well, it can be a path to reconstruct an ancient Egyptian lexicon, if I make sense.
I think that Andrea, do you have you were the one who showed the habitats? I think. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's a really interesting question, and I'm afraid I'm not able to answer now, because I think it's a quite compelling theme, but I have to think about it. I'm not sure of how to answer.
I imagine it's the sort of question that's going to come up over the next few days in various forms. So I'm sure we will have plenty of opportunity to discuss that further. Rita, do you have a question?
Yes, I also have a question for Andrea. I really love the fact that he used a very multidisciplinary framework of study and his comparison with the Japanese kanji. And I wonder if what he thinks about studying ancient Egyptian, the ancient Egyptian language and writing on a multidisciplinary level. So, for instance, having the students looking at other kind of writing, which is something that we don't do generally in Egyptological courses, but I always thought it would be great to do.
Well, I think it's a real compelling theme, because I think that to study a language such the ancient Egyptian hieroglyph, we should make a great use of our eyes. I mean, we should look at the writing as images. So comparing different kind of images, such as the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs or kanji, or even the pictorial, the cave art, it should be really useful to train our mind to separate the concept of our intellect by the image. And I think that images can really help us comprehending what the ancient Egyptians were trying to say. And I'm not saying that grammatic or lexic, it's not important, but we should study in these two parallel ways, from the grammatical point of view and from the aesthetic point of view. And I think that the disciplinary approach is crucial.
So now I'm moving to our second paper with Panayotis Kouchoulis. So he's a professor of Egyptology, vice head at the Department of Mediterranean Studies of the University of Aegean, and he's also director of studies of MA program Archaeology of the Eastern Mediterranean from prehistoric period to late antiquity, Greece, Egypt, and Near East. And he's also director of the Laboratory for Ancient Walid of the Eastern Mediterranean in the same institution. So he's going to speak on the modes of reception and an adaptation of the Egyptian writing in the inscribed Egyptiaca from archaic Greece. So the floor is yours, please, Panayotis.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, for your very kind words. Warmest thanks to the organizers of this wonderful conference and much promising conference. I'm delighted to be with you and see colleagues of mine even from a distance. We'll talk today about the adaptation of Egyptian writing in certain inscribed Egyptiaca from archaic Greece. Let me just introduce a little bit about the material and then go to the presentation of some case studies. In the absence of adequate written evidence in the early Iron Age, our knowledge of contacts in the Mediterranean usually stem from the study and evaluation of imports and the archaeologically visible influence in indigenous material horizons. Egyptian and Egyptianizing objects, the so-called Egyptiaca, distinctively reflect a rich and complex nexus of cross-cultural contacts between Egypt and the southeastern Mediterranean region via two main channels of communication: direct contact, mainly from the Asia Minor and East Greek areas with Egypt, and via the intermediary of Phoenician artifacts that spread all over the Mediterranean during the Orientalizing and Archaic periods. Although Egyptiaca were spread to Syro-Palestine, Cyprus, Anatolia, Greece, Italy, and Etruria, Sardinia, the Aegean material constitutes one of the greatest assemblages in the Mediterranean. A preliminary statistical overview shows that the numerical predominance of Egyptian and Egyptianizing scarabs, scaraboid seals, and imported amulets, fingers representing Egyptian deities. Significant is also the proportion of Ayan's vases, anthropomorphic and zoomorphic figurines, and amulets, which are associated with a local workshop or workshops, which has not yet been identified. The discovery of a scarab factory at Intokris testifies that similar artifacts were manufactured in the Nile Delta during the 6th century. The greatest amount of Egyptiaca has been found at sanctuaries, whereas the percentage from tombs is impressively low. This discrepancy should be taken into account in the interpretation approaches of the functionality and multifaceted meaning of these objects. For the scope of this presentation and the assumption to be made, I will confine myself to certain examples of the inscribed scaraboids, the most popular category of Egyptiaca in the Aegean, which is known in the bibliography as Lindos Perachora or Rhodes Perachora group. The majority of these scarabs depict debased good wish formulae or distorted combination of hieroglyphic signs. They are mainly found in Perachora, Heraum, Sparta, Paros, Delos, Rhodes, but also in Aegina, Chios, Ephesus, Miletus, Italy, and Etruria, Punic sites, and Cyprus. It has been stated that this type may also have been manufactured on Rhodes from the later half of the 8th century BC to the first half of the 7th century BC. The largest and more representative group of this type derives from the sanctuary of Hera Crealimnia at Perachora in mainland Greece. The sanctuary was situated in a small cove of the Corinthian Gulf at the end of the Perachora Peninsula. Cult activity at the site continued from the 9th century BC until the Roman invasion in 146 BC. The oldest temple dedicated to Hera, of which only a part of the foundation of its northern wall is preserved today, was built around 825 AD BC in the center of the cove, and in the place where the ruins of the later altar can be seen. Most of the Egyptiaca from the site were found on the upper precincts of the sanctuary near the so-called hearth building, a name given to it due to the discovery of a large four-sided hearth in its exterior. The earliest deposit group in which scarabs of this type were found is the so-called Egyptian pit, dated to 735 to 650 BC, situated in the area east of the hearth building. Later deposits are mainly situated in the east, northeast, and northwest of the hearth building and are dated to 700-590 BC. It is, however, noticeable that more than 70% of the material derives from deposit groups closed by 630 BC. Scarabs of this type are usually made of ayans of fine composition, covered with a green or blue glaze, which is rarely preserved. Two types are recognized. The first type includes scarabs with average dimensions of 1/4 to 1/5 plus 0.8. The head is usually triangular, has a single borderline, and is sometimes flanked by side plates of irregular trapezoidal shape. The clypeus is usually not serrated. The pronotum is outlined with a semicircular or angular single line, and the lateral suture is indicated by a single straight dividing line. In most cases, V-shaped nikes for the humeral colossetes are visible at the upper outer corners of the elytra, behind the line of the prothorax. The legs at side are quite well modeled with undercut triangular space. The second type has a more circular shape based on its bigger width and seems more bulky and tall. The head is also triangular with single borderline side plates, trapezoidal shape. All the lines of the back are single, wide, and deeply curved line. It has usually V-shaped nicks for the humeral colossetes. The legs at side are again well modeled with undercut triangular space. It is noteworthy that nearly half of the scarabs belonging to this type are composed of an extremely limited repertoire of signs, many of which are usually debased, such as the neb basket, the mud feather, often confused with a reed leaf representing the phonetic J, the sun disk or the phonetic het, the nefer sign, the ureus, the water sign, often written as horizontal stroke. The ongoing bibliographic analysis of this material from Perachora, housed today at the National Archaeological Museum of Athens, indicates four main groups. The first group bears variants of the formula neb mat ra, which may correspond to the prenomen of Amenhotep III or to the formula Ra is Lord of the Mat. The word mat, which is usually rendered with the goddess Mat in Egyptian examples, is replaced by the mat feather, and the sun disk is depicted without the internal boss case. The majority of scarabs with this garb text belong to workshop runs, while there are a few genuine Egyptian scarabs at the site which could have been used as prototypes. In variants of a hallmark A group, there are more signs, such as neber, nefer, mat, added to the core group, resulting in debased text. Most of the datable variants derived from the Egyptian pit or the Proto-Corinthian deposit, indicating that they were made almost simultaneously with a proper group. However, most workshop runs are closely related, indicating that there might have been phases in their manufacture. The hallmark A group proper includes 6 scarabs, while on one scarab, neb mat ra is rendered with a goddess mat, paralleling the standard Egyptian rendering. This iconographic detail, along with the difference in shape, may indicate that this scarab represents an import and would have been used as a prototype. Another workshop run includes scarabs with inscription neb mat ra, reversed, and 1 or 2 neb signs in 1 or 2 exerges. On one of the scarabs, the mat feather is so debased that would have been intended to represent nefer. On one scarab, neb mat ra is followed by nefer and neb basket, or nefer mat and neb. This scarab seems to be related to 2 workshop runs. In the first one, neb mat ra is followed by nefer, whereas the same group of signs is differently arranged in another variant. In the later series, the text on the underside of a scarab and the different morphology of the back indicate that it might have been a prototype. In the second run, neb mat ra is followed by the mat feather or a mat feather and a neb basket. As in the previous workshop runs, the form of signs is debased and the order of symbols incorrect. A different workshop run includes scarabs bearing the neb mat ra accompanied by a debased ankh. In the latter case, one of the scarabs of the group is accompanied, this one. Oh, sorry, this is, here we are. One of the longest workshop runs includes the basic formula followed by an ureus. Ureus in the case might replace mat feather or young symbol at the above workshop runs. Second main group includes scarabs bearing the text Imen or Imen Ra Nab, naming Amun-Ra is my lord or Imen Ra Mary, beloved of Amun-Ra. Here there are workshop runs of those who are almost identical pieces. Some bear a horizontal stroke which represent the phonetic complement and in the name Imen. Although on several scarabs the text is carved, their exams very well curved with striking, correct, and elaborate writing, which strongly indicate that they were imports that would have been used as prototypes for the other pieces. The third main group of variants includes the common good wish formula, every het nebet neferet, every good thing, with a sign Erch written as a simple disk without the horizontal striations. The text and its variants appear in the earliest deposit, the Egyptian pit, as well as in the latest level closed on 590 BC. Like previous series, there are many workshop runs of almost identical scarabs bearing variants of Ket, Nebet, Nefer. The good wish formula and variants was also very popular in Egypt in the third intermediate period and late periods, and among the proper group are a few scarabs whose morphology may imply that they were imports. The variants of the proper formula are based on different combination and arrangement signs and the addition of mat feather and neb. In another workshop of the nefer sign is replaced by the mat feather and the signs are often reversed. However, it also examples of the Imen Ra formula where the sign head can be interpreted as a debased rendering of the sun disk, the sign net would have been a very debased rendering of the sign men, and the horizontal stroke, which is presented in many examples, might correspond to the phonetic N. Thus, the translation "Amorize my lord" may somehow correspond to the debased text. In a variant of the later group, the neb sign is replaced by a mud feather or an ureus, resulting in totally meaningless text. A long workshop runs forms most likely a very degenerate variant of the head nebbed formula, which almost identical piece includes scarabs with mud ureus nebbed horizontal stroke, probably representing the phonetic et. According to the arrangement of signs, ureus in this case may replace the ket sign in the formula het nebbed neferet, or the stand discry in the formula imen ra. The last interesting group includes untranslatable text composed of a central nefer sign and two mud feather facing in the same direction. The motif is inspired from Egyptian prototypes where the nefer sign is flanked by two antithetically arranged reed leaves or mud feathers, or from the common formula nefer mad ankh, beauty truth life, often curved on a genuine Egyptian scarabs. It is noteworthy that two examples made of steatite have been found at Perahora and may have been used as prototypes for some of the degenerated series mentioned above. The last made but quite restricted group incorporates scarabs bearing simplus in different combination, which are totally meaningless. On a few scarabs, a city deity in the center holding a mud feather, most likely mud, is accompanied by various signs debased though. It is of great importance that most variants of Roach Perahora group of scarabs seem to be present only in Perahora and not in other sites. This could be considered as characteristic of a workshop as shown from other cases. It is noteworthy that the Fayum's factory at Pictorial, where a real workshop has been recognized, includes all the variants of the scarabs ascribed to it. The combinations include the neb mat formula, or a mat feather with an ankh and a neb sign, or the text imen ra neb. Since the scarabs cannot predate the 7th century BC, it is possible that these inscriptions are inspired from the Perahora group scarab discussed above. Shapes and underside inscriptions of the Perahora group indicate a relation with a local workshop, perhaps by Egyptian or Corinthian forger. Buller-Helbel supports the Rhodian origin of this type because of the important amount of scaraboids found at Lydons alongside with Egyptian prototypes. However, our research on the scarabs from Lindos and the Alissos weakens this theory. Although the Lindian material belongs to this type, the number is limited and the variety very low compared to the material from Perahora. As you can see from this preliminary chart here, the resemblance is 3 times smaller than the material from Perahora. There are very few workshop runs, less than 25% of the material, and even less identical pieces where some of the variants presented at Perahora are totally absent. A similar picture coming from Ialissus and Camerus, where the Roach Perahora type is very limited and the workshop runs very few. To conclude, the character of many votive offerings at the sanctuary indicated that Hera Perahora was mainly worshipped as fertility goddess, as Kurotrophos and protector of the household, and of course as a helper of seafarers since her second name was Limia. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that scarabs were popular among for women, children, and seafarers. Although hieroglyphic inscriptions on scarabs were most likely not conceivable outside Egypt, particular signs could be recognized. The repetition of signs with particular magical value, nefer, beautiful, ankh, life, match, truth, and the eclampsy rendering on the popular Gordon's type 12 indicates they were not interpreted just as decorative motifs, but rather as potential symbols of magic and regeneration. The main Egyptian prophylactic formulas represented, even in debased form, on this type of scarabs were very common on scarabs spreading the Mediterranean since the beginning of the first millennium BC, and may have been introduced along with scarabs at Perahora by itinerary traders, seafarers, and craftsmen who traveled or visited Egypt and were familiarized somehow with their meaning. Although all variants appear almost simultaneously in the early strata, Egyptian and Proto-Corinthian pits, there are many individual scarabs which might somehow connect to workshop runs, indicated phase of experimentation before the manufacture of a new another workshop run. All the variants strengthen further the idea that almost every workshop run is actually the result of copying and modifying another workshop run. In such case, certain scarabs may have been used as prototypes. This brief presentation above points to the polysemous interpretation of Egyptian materials and constants within the cultic environment of archaic Greece. It further underlines the necessity for a new unified methodological approach to the study of Egyptiaca, based on the creative combination of archaeological and typological contextualization, on the reception and adaptation of the hieroglyphic script, which lead to the investigation of potential magico-religious semantics behind these bodies, and at the end, to the reconsideration of the orientalizing orientalization terminology and phenomenon, complementing it perhaps with the Egyptianization subcategory. A new methodological procedure requires that future research will stop treating this material just as trinkets or as a secondary chapter of the orientalizing phenomenon, and will reevaluate the significance of such offerings as possible markers of intercultural perception and the possible transmission and interaction of Egyptian semantics in archaic Greece. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for this interesting presentation. Actually, the scarabs is a very interesting topic, and they are found in different places. So thank you again for this interesting topic. So now we are moving to the third presentation of this session. So it is of Amr Al-Hawani, Dr. Amr Al-Hawani. So Dr. Amr has been teaching Egyptology at the universities of Bonn and Cairo since 2006, and he is the holder of the Simpson Professorship of Egyptology at the American University of Cairo. And Dr. Amr has been visiting professor of Egyptian and religion at the Cairo University and a fellow of the Anne-Marie Schimmel College Center for Advanced Studies for Mamluk Studies, and he is also the co-director of Sarabit Academy Excavation Sinai and the co-director of the Epigraphic Survey Project at Qubbat al-Hawa, Aswan. So Dr. Amr will speak on how to think in hieroglyphs, visual speech, and the vocal discourse of the heart, logical strategies of the aesthetic representation in the Egyptian hieroglyphic scripts. And indeed, Dr. Amr, for unforeseen circumstances, so he will not be able to deliver his speech, and instead Stephen Quirke will read his paper.
Thank you very much, and I'll start sharing my screen now. Good, great. So I am only the simulacrum of Amma here, so I won't be able to take comments exactly, except to forewarn you that, of course, we can contribute to the discussion and the chat afterwards, but I should warn you that this idea of me being a simulacrum runs so much against the heart of what this talk is really about. It's a really brilliant paper. It's time to put on our thinking hats again and think hard. So the title of the conference, Rethinking Visual Aesthetics of Egyptian Writing. We need to ask, what is the aesthetics of writing? Is it only the visual aspect and its value that's the focus here? And what do we mean by what do we mean by aesthetics? Is this the beauty of the signs and their colorful manifestations, as some people have explored already, or is it the graphic, exactly the calligraphic features like the orthography of hieroglyphs, the arrangement of words, text layout, or the script and its cursive transformations, as with forms like ligatures, which Ursula Verhoeven has covered in the introductory talk. And finally, is our focus the aesthetics of reception of the hieroglyphs, how it appears for the reader, or is it rather the aesthesis, the experience of writing the hieroglyphs itself? Aesthetics means the perception of given things like an artwork or a piece of writing on many levels. Perception is to notice something special out of its neutral background or its context. Thus, aesthetic things could be beautiful or ugly depending on the contrast to their background. And in short, beauty or ugly things, beauty depends on the one who receives or interacts with that given object. So it could be what's beautiful for the audience, a specific audience with their cultural background and their visual experience in a given discourse. Yet it could also be the aesthetic experience of this artist or this scribe while writing or while drawing a piece of work. So the aesthetics of writing is a complex process of perception of scripts in a given discourse and in contrast to its context. And the discourse of context itself, of course, involves further ambiguities. The first point to clarify is on which level, with the help of which methodology, might we use the term discourse of context in a wider cultural use, as in discourse analysis, as in social and cultural studies, or a close reading, like the text-immanent close reading in the field of linguistics and literary studies. And in our Egyptological community, we've mainly been interested so far, with exceptions, of course, in that linguistic use of context. Now, the call for this conference, the call for papers, reminded us how Alan Gardner described the impact of Egyptian writing and infinities in paragraph 3 of his Egyptian grammar, stressing its main characteristics, where he sees Egyptian writing as marked by concrete pictorial realism, a preference for static expression, a rigid formality, strict word order, salient concision, and the fact that its rich vocabulary is not equally well developed in every direction. So that was Gardner's impression as a whole. And the crucial question is, which approach, which ideas, which methodology led him to these conclusions? For from a similar point of view, Heinrich Schäfer and von Traut developed a thesis on the aspective as a principle of Egyptian art, based on the cultural evolutionary and German historicist approach, which sees the start of writing systems in pictographic writing, as Adolf Ehrmann and his Berliner Schule did. And the philosophical background here is the universality question. Does the word or utterance refer to something real in the world? That is the central question, still today in the philosophy of language and in logic, with widely divergent answers, but we can summarize that debate in these two positions. In the first, an idealist transcendental position, the world is divided into two realms, the world of real ideas and the world of shadows and simulacra, as in the Greek traditions of Plato and Aristotle, in German idealism, Kant, Hegel, so forth. And secondly, the materialistic immanent position, that deals with a complex world model consisting of varieties in a permanent state of flux. And here we're in the world of pre-Socratic natural philosophers and the Stoics and the postmodern philosophers like Foucault-Serre and Deleuze. As mentioned before, the great scholars like Ehrmann, Gardner, Zeta from the Berlin School of Egyptology, who established and systematized the academic study of Egyptian language as we practice it nowadays, represent that first position. So let me summarize that whole debate in two further questions. Is the Egyptian writing static, formal, rigid? Is the Egyptian pictorial realism referring to real objects located in and related to given rigorous and static categories? And the first stage in discussing these questions is to take a critical look at those ambiguous Egyptological terms like pictogram, ideogram, logogram, and determinative that swarm through our descriptions of such inscriptions here. Pictorial writing, as Ehrmann called it, has been considered the first step in the development of Egyptian hieroglyphs, pictographische Schreiben. In his interpretation of the dramatic passages of the Memphite theology on the Shabako stone, Ehrmann dates the text, or at least these dramatic passages, to the 4th millennium BC, to prehistory, because of the pictorial representations of the speakers and the topic of speech in this famous dialogue of gods. The vertical lines begin at the top of every column before the dialogue marker Jed Badu in. Look at the top part of the line drawing, probably easy to see on the right, but I want you to see the stone as well. As we see in line 11a, Geb stands opposite Horus. This creates a visual representation of the speakers in front of each other. It visualizes the act of speaking itself, but we are dealing here with proper names. That means it is not Geb himself or Horus himself to be found at the top of the writing column, but the written names referring to them. We do not need to read Geb Cheft Her Geb facing Horus, as Zeta or as Curler did. Rather, we have to understand visually that the speech is coming from the mouth of Geb addressing Horus. It is a vehicle to picture the scene and to contextualize the divine dialogue. So that is one example of this pictographic use. At the middle of the column, we have two registers in two squares with what Zeta called Szenische Vermerk, stage notes for a performance, for a scene. And we know from the dramatic Ramessean papyrus in the Middle Kingdom that these additional squares represent ritual objects of the scene or the speech topic, the main actor. And we understand the divine order by Geb through that summary as follows. Horus must go back to the place where his father drowned, Ain Yatura in the north. And Seth must go back to Ombos in the south where he was born. The decision of Geb was to divide the counterports. So then, in line 12, we see nothing. We see nothing in the scenic note in the relevant square. And the question is how to read this empty square. Is empty, no one, maybe the divided ones? I think it is not just to tell us that the scene must be empty at this moment of the mystery play, the performance. Rather, the empty square must be read as showing the result of the divine order, not a requirement of a performance. And the third use of such pictograms in the Shabaka stone is that dashed and scratched out Seth signs you find here in lines 30 to B, just on the edge where the later use of millstone has taken away the surface. As we know, Ramesside manuscripts also prescribed the name of Seth. So it was usual not just to write the name of Seth, it was not just usual not to write the name of Seth to avoid him altogether, but to write the name first and then to erase or to annul the figure of this deity in a second step. So you, the reader, you have to see the traces of the abolished figure and to recognize Seth, and at the same time cross him out. To know you have to cut him from the reading. Two messages are visualized here. It is Seth, and he is ostracized and demonized. And the same practice is also tested in other writings, which avoid ideographic writing, as with the name of Ra, although in that case, after sacralization of his name, the hidden name of Ra is taboo and not to be addressed directly through an image, ideographically. As we see in these three examples on the Shabaka stone, pictograms are not being used to express the thing in itself or to refer to its essential reality. It's not here about things, but about names for things. So much for the pictogram. So then is the thing in itself the logogram. Gardner's theory of proper names focuses on the phonetic aspects of naming, why you call a tree in English. The arbitrary character of the phonetic value of names shows us that a logogram is just calling the name of one thing, not more and not less. And according to Gardner, the ancient Egyptian onomastica, which we've just been discussed, are just lists with names of things for him without any meta level, without any lexical categorizations or reflections. And given that Egyptological reception, in this context, it's crucial to recall the shifting character of Egyptian signs. A logogram can be a determinative of a word or a thing in itself, or even a transmitter of a phonetic value. We have to ask ourselves when the ancient writer used a logogram with a stroke. When were they writing the word in a combination of these consonantal signs with phonetic complements and a determinative? When in which context is the plural w written with plural strokes and a papyrus roll in the abstract word neferu? And when is it written with three nefer signs? In that example, a phonetic value is expressing the semantic field of abstraction, of the abstract things, manifested graphically without using the phonetic sign for word, as we all know, the quailshik. On the other hand, moving in a different direction, nefer can also be found written with the cha'u, sail sign, evoking the beauty, neferu, of the northern wind, exemplifying how homonyms can give a specific meaning, phonetic value, with the help of an entirely different glyph. Gardner's observation concerning the inaccurate term determinative in paragraph 23 of his grammar is important here in the blue box at the bottom. Does the ideogram determine the phonograms or vice versa? The main characteristic of that first position in answering the universality question is phonocentrism. From the point of view of alphabetic abstract thinking rationalism, we have to decide if the ideogram determines the sense of the phonograms or not. So you can read one ideogram in different ways with different phonetical values, and therefore we need the phonograms to know exactly which reading is the right one. Or conversely, phonograms without an ideogram as the determinative are ambiguous in meaning, given all the homonyms. In his theory of proper names, as I mentioned, Gardner stressed that need for the phonetic values in the process of disambiguating a proper name. The Wörterbuch from Ehrman cites one attestation from the Memphite theology for the Egyptian lexeme ma'ach, meaning to name. The act of name giving is the work of the creator God as an intellectual process of thinking up the name of things with the ideogram of heart as a determinative. And in the Wörterbuch, ma'ach also has that other meaning of granite, you see on the right, or hard stone in the sense of making an object hard with the sign representing a stone vessel as a determinative. And those taking the first position on the universality question might argue the heart is the intellectual instinct of human being, is dealing with the abstract ideas, the tongue is the uttering organ, which makes the abstract name physically possible through audible signs. And maybe the granite vessel sign is confusingly similar to the heart, so the first position may cast this as a problem of ancient scribes transcribing into hieroglyphs from a hieratic template. This is scribal error. The second position will argue instead that the sense of ma'ach as naming is unique in the Memphite theology. The phonetic similarity indicates an etymological connection driven from the same root generating similarities in the sense of both words. So I would argue the Egyptian aesthetics of writing includes all these three dimensions: semantic, material, cognitive. Exactly as Gilles Deleuze summarized and put to the point in the title of his book, Logique du Son, Logic of Sense. Deleuze aimed to describe the process of giving sense, meaning, by focusing on the dynamics of difference and repetition, or better on the endless semantic process of shifting. So beware, postmodern philosophers are interested in hieroglyphs. Derrida asked this question, how to think in hieroglyphs. He began his critique of the phonocentrism of modern Western thinking when he moved to establish his philosophy of difference in his book of grammatology more than 50 years ago. In this approach, graphic elements refer to a wide perspective of hieroglyphic expressive resources instead of narrow modern alphabetic phonosemantics. He used the hieroglyphs as a contrast to the alphabetic Eurocentric phonocentrism. Now, Deleuze did not mention Egyptian hieroglyphs in his work directly, but his description of the logic of sense seems astonishingly helping for studying the aesthetics of Egyptian writing. Deleuze writes, it is the characteristic of event to be expressed or expressible, uttered or utterable in propositions which are at least possible. So sense is expressible in language and is to be found in a complete sentence as the smallest unit of meaning. Well, I would argue in our case that the word, consisting of several significant hieroglyphs, could be the smallest meaningful unit in Egyptian written language. Deleuze describes the different relations within the logical proposition which we can apply to an Egyptian word utterance and which could be useful for the questions of terms and definitions describing the different possible states of hieroglyphic signs. First of all, the denotation or indication to express the relation of the sentence to an external state of affairs, which is individuated in qualities, quantities, etc. It's important to stress here that certain signs, in the terms of Deleuze and his words, function in all cases as empty forms for the selection of images, for the denotation of each state of affairs. These signs do not represent universal concepts, as we imply using the term classifiers instead of determinatives in recent hydrological research. Because, Deleuze argues, again to use his words, they are formal particulars. They function as pure designators of indexicals. The manifestation is the second relation, of the sentence or word with one who speaks and expresses himself. This is the statement of desires and beliefs corresponding to the proposition. And again, importantly here, Deleuze emphasizes these desires and beliefs, they're causal inferences, not kind of linked to automatic associations. Desire is the internal causality of the image with respect to the existence of the object, and belief an external causality. And the third dimension there is signification. So we're deep in philosophical terminology and logic here, but it will help us maybe in this classified determinative problem. The third dimension of the proposition is signification, expressing the relation of the sign to universals and general concepts, its context, its syntactic connections to the implications of the concept or the context as a proposition, a sentence, or as a complete, coming back to our case in this conference, a complete, meaningful Egyptian written word. Signification is a general element of demonstration, maybe in a wider sense, neither premise nor conclusion. So from these three, from denotation to manifestation or signification or the reverse, we're carried along a circle of the statement, or in our case, the circle of the Egyptian word. And around all these, we have sense, meaning, the fourth dimension, what is expressed by the proposition. Incorporeal, complex, irreducible entity at the surface of things, pure event which inheres in the proposition. It's not in one of those three dimensions, it's their sum. So the answer of the Stoics to the question of universality would be, we're not dealing with either body or word, not sensible representations, nor rational representations. Deleuze is inviting us to recognize the complex status of sense, that which is expressed. On the one hand, it does not exist outside the proposition which expresses it. What is expressed does not exist outside its own expression. And on the other hand, it does not merge at all with the proposition. Although this is all coming out of French postmodern modernity, it's only appropriate to remember almost 1,000 years ago with Abdul Jani, how Nasser Hamid Elsayed and Sister Kassem more recently have emphasized the importance of exactly Giorgiani's investigation, his articulation of what it means to utter a statement, how you create this logic, the construction of assertion. It's a social and semantic act. So there are further avenues to be pursued that are being pursued in the relation between the classical Arabic commentators and the postmodern. I'm going to go back one, sorry, too soon for Egyptology. We need to step into it out of this philosophical stuff. So after this hard logical philosophical stuff, I would suggest we rethink our terms describing Egyptian signs. We have many suggestions from Deleuze to choose from: designator, implier, associator for the term determinative, or the term contour, the logic marker of a proposition, important in logical studies since Gottlieb Frege. A determinative could be sometimes all of that, but the most important point is the dynamics of Egyptian visual representation in general and the shifting state of the sign, glyph, in Egyptian writing system and practice. We know the hieroglyphic writing system uses different categories of signs. We know how to differentiate between them in a context. I want to focus instead here on the shifting process itself. These three continually shifting categories of determinative, pictogram, and logogram. The determinative can be silent, but in reading we have to decide if we read the sign as not as a determinative, but as a phonogram or a logogram. Many examples of words have more than one determinative, over-determination. Many cases of words are written phonetically without any determinative at all, under-determination. What then is this Egyptian logic of sense? The aesthetics of Egyptian writing is the complex process of giving sense. I want to close with some examples to reconnect what we've been looking at in the Egyptological sphere with this philosophical argument. In her study on offering lists and tables in Theban New Kingdom tomb chapels, Anke Weber shows us that in one and the same tomb, sometimes on the same wall, we can find three modes of representing offerings. You can have the offerings on the table, the thing in itself, a bird, an ox head, fish. Beside the offering table, the written names of the offerings, and then we see the depiction of the lector reading from a papyrus, and beside him, the offerings tabulated in a grid which represents the audible voice of the lector pronouncing the names of these offerings in sequence in a ritual. And sometimes we even have objects which combines all three strategies, like the offering table of Defigi. Defigi shows us the image of the offering, the name of the offering, and the grid. Reality is depicted in Egyptian art in a complex way, on a multi-layered understanding, with things which we can see as positive objects. We have unseen, hidden, abstract things for which we can invent a special representation, like the bar. Or there are things we cannot see, but we can perceive with other senses. As a case in between, coming back to the mundus imaginaris, a case in between, like words that are uttered, the singing we can hear but not see, something we cannot see but not grasp, like smoke, or we can see but not smell it, like the incense shown as a cone on the heads of the people at a banquet. In hieroglyphs, we can observe the same strategies, precisely, for example, how to write the human bar, with a fluttering bird as a phonogram for the sound value, a bird with a human head to indicate this is part of a human being, and with an ideogram showing an incense vessel. Just about see it on the chapel jamb there, or clearly in Garden sign list G53. Incense vessel with its flame and smoke to express the idea that bar soul is not to be seen, like the sense of incense, which we can only indexically imagine in a depiction. So this ideogram, incense vessel with flame, represents that secret hidden aspect of the human soul, which the Egyptian calls bar. It's not just about the flight, it's a complex image. All of that is discussed in the details enough already, but I would like to stress the fact that all aspects of a concept in its complexity are deployed together in one place, in one sentence, in one sign at the same time. There are phonograms, ideograms, sense signs, classifiers, logograms, all constantly poised to change their status. It's not about classifications or categories. It's about the act of making meaning in a specific context. It is what Deleuze calls the logic of sense. So the multiple elements are all involved together in the process of making meaning in a sentence or proposition, all participate in this process. We cannot cut them off from each other. Deleuze said that sense is all that together in the proposition, not to be caught in it. And more important than discussing the categories or defining the terms, it's dynamics as a hieroglyphs, transforming themselves to give that specific meaning in a certain context, what Sohag called alchimie graphique, this alchemy with the help of signs, humanistic, not pantheistic, life world, thought world, justifies graphically that the one could be manifested here in everything at the same time. Every single thing exists individually in itself, independent from this soul one. Every sign can be read or used in different ways, depending on the context. So the expression logic of sense answers the universality question from an Egyptian point of view. Sense is physical and intellectual at one and the same time. And the aesthetics of writing is to understand the process of ascribing in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic practice. Context-dependent, open-ended, not the meaning in itself. There is no meaning in itself, but different meanings in different contexts. Determinative, logogram, stroke, pictogram, phonetic complement, each is an ascriber. Decision how to write the word in a certain context is an act of inscription. So to cite the title of Umberto Eco, similar but not the same. God is not everything in a pantheistic manner. You can see God in everything. And that's why the writing system develops its complex variety of expressing that graphic alchemy recognized by Sohag. Senses and sense and their combination are as if tied together in a Möbius strip of language. They don't exist separately. They must always be read in a simultaneous move. You can separate the aspects heuristically by cutting the Möbius strip, straightening it out from the surface with the sense perceptions on one side and sense meaning on the other. And the system of langue, competence, the rules of speech, enables this or makes it seem possible. Whereas on the level of the word parole, it is impossible. The system separates the determinative from the sense the proposition is just a classifier, whereas the practice of speech shows the status of the sign is continually changing. The determinative can transform itself into a phonogram or ideogram of its own. We need the categories and the categorization. This means only heuristically in order to understand. This model should not be reified and taken literally. The practice of speech shows constructive, not structuring tendencies. For sense or meaning cannot be found once and for all. We must always make meaning anew, always struggle for it. And so finally, I would say Egyptian writing is not concrete realistic, it is immanent monistic. It brings to the fore, so forget Gardner, it brings to the fore not the static, but the dynamics of presence, not only with strict formality, but also with a blurred state and a constant flux and a very suggestive concision of vocabulary and expressions. The aesthetics of Egyptian writing is not pictorial realism, static state, rigid word order, formality. No, the aesthetics of Egyptian resides in its graphic alchemy, its dynamic transformations, in its immanent understanding of presence and reality, like the Möbius strip, one entity with two surfaces active at the same time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Quirke, for your effort to read the paper of our colleague, Dr. Amr Hawari. Thank you. It's very interesting, and I think it will raise many questions. So now we are moving to our 20 minutes for questions and debates. So please, raise your hand in order to deliver. So first we have Angela McDonald. Please.
Thank you. Wow, that was just absolutely fantastic. I enjoyed all three papers thoroughly, and particularly that very dynamic delivery of the last paper. What a pity Amr can't be with us today, but I think Stephen did a fantastic job of getting us all stirred up. My question, since Amr is not here for me to gush about his paper specifically, but it ties into what he was talking about, goes back to the first paper today of this session by Catherine. I wondered if I could get her to speak a little bit more about the dynamics and the animacy of hieroglyphs, which I think was coming out strongly in the last paper as well. So I've fired you off a quick question about that. I love this idea, and I think this is something really important for us to keep alive in our discussions, of this constantly shifting aliveness of hieroglyphs. And I think your paper was really touching upon that, Catherine. So can you talk a little bit about the animacy of hieroglyphs?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a wonderful question. I think one of the things that when we're dealing with writing is that, you know, oftentimes we think of writing, at least in the modern sense, as a representation of, you know, language that is, you know, spoken language or this abstract concept of language. And when we're dealing with, obviously, hieroglyphs or even any alphabetic language, which is not as fully phonetic as we want to give it credit for, that there's a lot happening there. And when we look at hieroglyphs specifically, you know, there's, I think, this sense that there is power in writing, that there's power in its written form that does not need to have the performance of it to effectuate that power. I think that's part of it, absolutely, 100%. But it also exists as a power in and of itself. Andreas Priest has a fantastic article sort of about the indwelling of the Ba and the power in the hieroglyphs. And so I think when we look at sort of these like late texts, in the Greco-Roman period, like the Book of Thoth, but other things, there's a really fascinating sort of metaphor that really brings to light that this was a, you know, fully Egyptian conception and articulated, and a discourse that there were shifting aspects to the power of a sign and how it could be used. And I think this all ties in with the fact that, you know, writing and reading are deeply complex processes. Literacy is incredibly rich and detailed, and it encompasses such a range, from the use of graphic systems that do not have to do with language, like Ben Herring's fantastic work on like pseudo signs, and this extension of how signs might play into the larger Egyptian landscape of people who are fully not literate, partially literate, all the way up to someone like an elite scribe that I was talking about. Sorry, I went off a little bit. I hope that answered your question.
No, at all. No, it did, and I think I like to hear this word shifting, and I think that particularly resonated with me, because this is something that I hope to explore with my paper on Saturday. This idea that we can't quite pin signs down to do just one thing, even though we want that. And I wonder whether, in that context, this idea of writing and reading and this binary that we're creating between signs that are received and signs that are produced, whether there's something else in between where the signs themselves have a little bit of agency as they're created. Certainly in the Greco-Roman period, I think that is absolutely to the forefront, but earlier on as well. So yeah, the agency of signs by themselves, I'm quite interested in. Thank you very much for the answer.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Angela. So who is next? Yeah, Silvana, please. Yes, Silvana, we don't hear you. Yes, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
All right. My question is just about the reference that Catherine just gave about the indwelling of the bow in hieroglyphs. The hieroglyphs are the bow of Ra. Well, and I'm interested in the article she mentioned. I couldn't pick it. She was speaking very fast. I just went the name, the article.
Yeah, I don't have the title off the top of my head, but I just put the author. I will find it and I will put the article in. I think it's in, I don't know, Beatrice Thyssen. I don't know. I will find the reference for you and send it to you.
Who is the author? Who is the author?
Whoops, I direct message that. Sorry, hold on. It's in the chat.
Okay.
Andreas Priest.
Okay. This is the one who said the rituals in the late period and Ptolemy. Okay, thanks. Just that.
Sure.
Okay, thank you, Silvana. So, who's next? Please raise your hand. Okay, myself, I have a question for Panayiotis. It's about the scarabs. I don't know if you know that many scarabs have been found in the Gulf area, and recently our colleague Dr. Said Mahfouz has published an article on some scarabs that were found in Failaka Island, and they bear the name of Egyptian kings. And also some scarabs were found in the area of north-south of Saudi Arabia. So my question is, do you think that is there any possible relation between the scarabs found here and there, the distribution of the scarabs? I know they are easy to carry from Egypt to other places, but can you think that there's any relation to the distribution of scarabs in the Mediterranean basin, for example?
Yes, Ahmed, thank you. Yes, this is actually true. The problem is that we have quite a few material that related to these caraboid seals with inscribed debased hieroglyphs all over the Mediterranean. The crucial point here is to try to compare this inscribed material with some material we have from the other Egyptiaca sites, which is not actually scaraboids, but basically bear similar debased hieroglyphic signs, and to use this paleographic comparison in order to draw some not definite conclusions, but basically to see if there is any relations in the distribution. You know, the main question here is whether these items are actually genuine products, parts of this distribution, or they are manufactured locally. The common reception is that there were local workshops for most of the Egyptianizing objects in the Aegean Islands, especially situated on roads or in Perachora. But we have no archaeological evidence for that. So the crucial point is to differentiate these items that bear some similarities with genuine objects and try to find some other ways to approach the Egyptianizing objects, not just typological affiliations with the prototyped ones.
Excellent, thank you very much. So our colleague Khalid Hassan from Cairn University, please, Dr. Khalid.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. It's a pleasure to attend online this conference. My question goes to Panayotis about the scarab that inscribed with the feather that representing might. As he described it, he said that it's consists of the feather might plus ureus plus horizontal stroke with the sign nib. So do you have any interpretation for these inscriptions?
No, not actually. This is the problem. We do have some, according to me, in correct order signs on these scaraboids. There are some of them that make sense, some others that are debased, and we compare it with Egyptian prototypes, they don't make sense. But we think that the local manufacturers, if we accept this opinion, adopted some semantics of these signs. It is actually the semantic aspect behind these hieroglyphic debased inscriptions, which is important if we want to properly analyze this material under the diffusion that are being made during this archaic orientalizing periods. We are not quite sure if they want to make sense out of it, but basically they want to reproduce something that maybe it's of magical or religious value or of religious piety to them. And if you compare these scaraboid materials with other, especially the deities materials we have from especially the Aegean Islands, Samos and Rhodes, we can see that there is a preference to not deities that are very common among the Egyptians, but basically lesser deities that are more used to things like personal piety or magical religious beliefs. So we think that it's basically the reproduction of the semantics behind these hieroglyphic signs, not actually the real sense of them.
Actually, I have another comment. I have an interpretation for these inscriptions, but I'm not sure if they are right or not. But for me, I can read it as might, and the race could be a representation for Wajid, and the horizontal sign could be the sign for the Ta, the land for the land. So we can read it as might and might, Wajid, Nipti, Ta. So Maat and the Wajid are the ladies of the land. So it could be a possible interpretation for these inscriptions. Thank you, and thank you for interesting the representation and for the interesting material. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khalid, for your nice remarks. So we still have about 7 minutes for our next question. To finish this session, please. Who is next? You are tired? So, yes, again, Silvana.
Okay,
Yes.
can I or?
Yes, of course, please.
Well, what I'd like just to make a comment. I don't dominate, specialize in Ptolemaic hieroglyphs. It's about the talk of Catherine. What's interesting is in the heading of the Papyrus Carlsberg 7 is the Uhat, which is which refers to the traditional instruction genre, and specifically the onomastica. And I would like to ask her if she's looking into the question of transmission, let's say since the Ramesseum papyri, the Amenemope papyri, the Amenemope papyrus. Well, I'm asking about the transmission, in terms of continuity of the tradition of onomastica in the Greek-Roman period. It looks like in the Greek-Roman period, they developed a lot of compilation practice, but some are attested in the pharaonic period. Well, just want her to talk about transmission of the onomastica genre.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic question. Obviously, you're completely correct. There is a long tradition of the onomastica, even going back to that writing board from Giza that has, the list of kings' names and other things on it. So it's very clearly an approach, which actually I think is sort of fascinating, is how much, for example, if we look in the cross-cultural perspective, we have such a smorgasbord of like lexical texts from Mesopotamia that really attest to like the onomastica as a genre form being embedded in sort of basic scribal training. And yet when we look at the Egyptian evidence, for example, the onomasticon of Amenemope, or we turn to the Greco-Roman period and the Neptunus onomasticon, these are so very clearly not the text of students. They are instead the work of master scribes, of elites. I'm going to forget the exact wording of the title, but the title of the onomasticon of Amenemope like talks about that it encompasses all of these things. It's incredibly elaborate.
It's very interesting, and the term wahaib is crucial, I think,
yes,
because it's the sort of advanced knowledge. And you mentioned the word best. I just jotted, hey, because I'm interested in this term. In this knowledge is kind of divinely inspired. It is. It's not simply experience. The term for experience describes shisa, but here you are uha and initiated best. So
right. So yeah, no, absolutely. So the later material makes it very clear. So for example, whether it's Pictorial 7 or any of these others that are dealing with uha itinus, in the context of sort of like the describing hidden things and secret things, it's very clearly about, secret hidden knowledge, not about like making this widely accessible. That's, again, you get this reference to the, Temple of Abydos in the beginning of Pictorial 7. So all of that, it goes into it, but definitely uha as a term for sort of intellectual engagement with things is richly attested in the New Kingdom outside even of onomastica. It's, occurs in various different autobiographies talking about individuals.
And the king, because I saw these royal inscriptions, it is very interesting. And I was going to ask you something else, but I forgot, sorry. Sorry.
Hopefully I answered your question. Absolutely. There is a continuity of tradition and a continuity of approach, for sure.
Yes. Okay, thanks. About code commentaries, comments. What is new, at least as far as I know, are the comments that are added to the onomastica, just as Gardner criticized it. Oh, this was the Ramesseum papyri and papyrus and the Amenemop-Onomaskar, the horrible origins of our encyclopedia. But
if you would like another version of that, when the Tanis sign papyrus was first found, I believe Griffith said something to the effect of, "This is at once very interesting and greatly disappointing." The Tanis sign.
Hey,
there was some. Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry.
it's okay. Thank you, Silvana, because now we are about 1 minute to finish, and I think the organizer would like to wrap it up. So I should stop now, and I deliver the floor to Rita, Stephen, and Hany. Please.
Yes, thank you, Ahmed, for chairing this second and last session for today. I think it was very successful. There's so much food for thought, as I was saying in the chat. I don't know if Stefan and Hany wants to say anything before we resume to tomorrow and say bye to everyone.
Just to say thank you to the chairs and the other speakers. It's been a really exciting afternoon. Yeah, well, afternoon in London, morning for someone else. So I think, yeah, we have a really great foundation today for tomorrow.